Tonight, we're going to explore one of the North's most remarkable houses, one that sits on a remote island where the wind never stops howling and the sea never stops threatening. We'll journey to Bear Island, that wind-battered rock off the western coast of the North, and discover the people who have held it for thousands of years. We'll learn about House Mormont, whose words are simply, "Here we stand," and who have stood generation after generation through wars and winters, raids and rebellions, loss and loyalty. We'll meet warriors and exiles, lords and ladies, those who kept faith and those who broke it, and we'll understand what it means to be the North's western shield. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a tale of endless battle and bloodshed, though battles there certainly were. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the long history of this house, from their mysterious origins in the Age of Heroes to their final stand against the darkness itself. We'll examine the harsh land that shaped them, the values they held across centuries, the price they paid for their loyalty. By the end, I think you'll find that the story of House Mormont is really a story about endurance, about what it means to stand when standing is all you can do. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath. Let the concerns of the day fall away like snow melting in your hand. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, and let the story of the bear and the island that bred it unfold before you like a map being slowly unrolled across a table. The world can wait. For now, there are only voices from the past and the quiet space you've made for yourself tonight. The origins of House Mormont are lost in the mists of time, buried so deep in history that even the maesters of the Citadel can only speculate about how and when they first came to Bear Island. We're talking about events that happened thousands of years before Aegon's conquest, back in the Age of Heroes, when the first men still ruled the North and the Andals had not yet crossed the narrow sea. Back when history blends into legend, when the line between what actually happened and what people wish had happened becomes impossible to draw. Bear Island itself sits off the western coast of the North, north of the stony shore, a place where the sunset sea crashes against dark rocks and thick forests grow right down to the water's edge. It's not a large island, perhaps 10 leagues across at its widest point, and it's not a gentle place. The winters there are brutal, lasting for years when the long winters come, burying the island under snow and ice. The summers are short and often cold, with fogs rolling in from the sea and rain falling more days than not. It's the kind of place that either breaks people or makes them harder than the rocks themselves. The trees on Bear Island are mostly pine and ironwood, growing thick and dark, and in those ancient forests bears still roam. Real bears, the great black bears and brown bears of the North, creatures as tall as a man when they stand on their hind legs, with claws that can tear through wood and leather as easily as you might tear paper. The island takes its name from these bears, and House Mormont takes its sigil from them as well, a black bear on a green field, simple and fierce, just like the people who chose it. How the Mormonts first came to the island, we simply don't know. Some stories suggest they were younger sons of House Stark, sent to hold this strategic point against enemies from the sea. Others claim they descend from the first men who lived on the island since time immemorial, before even the Starks unified the North under their rule. There are even tales, probably fanciful, that the first Mormont took the island from the Ironborn, who had held it as a base for their raids, driving them out in some ancient battle that no record remembers. What we do know, or what the histories suggest with some confidence, is that House Mormont has held Bear Island for at least 5,000 years, perhaps much longer. They were already ancient when the Andals invaded Westeros. They were already established, already known for their fierceness and their loyalty to Winterfell, when the Maesters first began keeping reliable records. This kind of continuity is rare. Even in the North where houses trace their lineages back to the Dawn Age, to hold the same harsh land for millennia, generation after generation, surviving wars and winters and the slow grind of time itself, tells us something important about these people, The relationship between House Mormont and House Stark goes back so far that its origins are as mysterious as the Mormonts themselves. But from the earliest records we have, the Mormonts were sworn to the Kings of Winter at Winterfell. They bent the knee to the Starks, gave them loyalty and service, and in return received the Starks' protection and the right to rule Bear Island in their name. This feudal bond would prove remarkably enduring, lasting through every crisis, every change of dynasty, every transformation that Westeros would undergo. Bear Island's location made it strategically important, though in a grim way. It sat directly in the path of Ironborn raiders sailing from the Iron Islands around the western coast of the north. The Ironborn, those seafaring reavers who lived by what they called the Old Way, the practice of taking what belonged to others through raid and conquest, had been the North's enemy since before memory. They worshipped the drowned god and believed that paying the iron price, taking things by force, was more honourable than paying the gold price, trading for them peacefully. For the Mormonts, this meant that their island was always a target. Spring would come, the seas would calm enough for longships to sail, and the Ironborn would come raiding. They would beach their ships on Bear Island's rocky shores, burn what they could, take what they wanted, and sail away before the Mormonts could muster enough force to stop them. It was a pattern that would repeat for thousands of years, a cycle of violence as regular as the seasons themselves, and it shaped everything about House Mormont. Living under this constant threat did something to the people of Bear Island. It made them vigilant, always watching the sea for sails, always ready to grab weapons and fight. It made them practical, building their homes and halls in ways that could be defended, storing supplies in hidden places where raiders wouldn't find them, teaching even their children how to fight. And it made them fierce, because if you couldn't be fierce on Bear Island, if you couldn't stand and fight when the Ironborn came, you simply wouldn't survive. There's a tradition on Bear Island, one that sets it apart from almost every other place in Westeros, and that's the tradition of women fighting. Now, in most of the Seven Kingdoms, even in the north, warfare was considered men's work. Women ran the household, managed the estates when their husbands were away, but they didn't train with swords or fight in battles. But on Bear Island, this distinction couldn't hold. When the Ironborn came, they didn't care if you were a man or a woman, a warrior or a farmer. They would kill you just the same, or worse, take you as a thrall, a slave to work until you died. So the women of Bear Island learned to fight, not because of some progressive philosophy about equality, but because practical necessity demanded it. When the men were away fishing or hunting, when a raid came suddenly, the women needed to be able to defend their homes and children. Over generations, this necessity became tradition, and that tradition became part of the Mormont identity. A Mormont woman was expected to know how to wield an axe or a spear, as well as how to weave or cook. It wasn't remarkable on Bear Island, it was simply how things were done. The harsh environment shaped the Mormonts in other ways too. Bear Island could support only a small population, a few thousand people at most, scattered in small villages and isolated homesteads, with the largest concentration at the Mormont Keep itself. The soil wasn't particularly fertile, the growing season was short, and farming was always a struggle. The islanders relied more on fishing, on hunting in the forests, on logging the pine and ironwood that grew thick and tall. They traded timber and furs to other parts of the north, brought in grain and other supplies they couldn't produce themselves. This meant that the Mormonts were never wealthy, never powerful in the way that larger houses were powerful. They couldn't field armies of thousands, they couldn't build great castles with soaring towers. Their keep was solid and defensible, but simple, built from the dark stone of the island and the timber of its forests. They had enough to survive, to maintain their independence, to fulfill their duties to House Stark, but not much more. They were what we might call a minor house, though that term doesn't quite capture it. They were small, yes, but they were also essential, holding a position that had to be held, doing a job that had to be done. The bears that gave the island its name were both a danger and a resource. These great beasts would sometimes attack livestock or even people, and hunting them was a rite of passage for young Mormonts. A way of proving courage and skill, but the bears also provided thick furs that could keep a person warm through the longest winter, and bearskin cloaks became something of a Mormont tradition, a symbol of the house and the island. To wear a bearskin was to carry a piece of Bear Island with you, to show where you came from and what had shaped you. In those ancient times before the Andals came, before the dragons arrived in Westeros, the Mormonts lived in a world that was in some ways simpler and in some ways harder than what would come later. They worshipped the old gods, the nameless gods of the first men, in groves of weirwood trees scattered across the island. They followed the old customs, the old ways of doing things that had served their ancestors. They fought the Ironborn, served the Starks, endured the winters, and raised their children to do the same. We don't know the names of those early Mormonts. The ones who held the island in the Age of Heroes and the long years that followed. The records simply don't exist. Or if they ever did, they've been lost to time and fire and the endless entropy that destroys all human creations eventually. But we can imagine them, can't we? We can imagine a Lord Mormont perhaps standing on the shore of his island, watching for iron-born sails on the horizon, knowing that his duty was simply to stand there, to hold what was his, to protect what had been entrusted to him. We can imagine a Lady Mormont teaching her daughter how to hold a spear, how to stand your ground when everything in you wants to run, how to be strong enough to endure. These early Mormonts, whoever they were, whatever their names, they established something that would last. They created a tradition of service and strength, of loyalty to Stark and dedication to duty, that would be passed down through generations like an inheritance more valuable than gold or land. They learned how to survive on their harsh island, how to stand against enemies who kept coming year after year, how to maintain their identity and their independence in a world that was often violent and always uncertain. The Age of Heroes gave way to later ages. The First Men mixed with the Andals in the south, though the north remained largely First Men in blood and culture. The centuries rolled on in their slow procession, and through it all the Mormonts endured on their island. Kings of winter rose and fell in Winterfell. Other houses grew powerful and then declined. Dynasties changed. Alliances shifted. The map of the north was redrawn by war and marriage and the accidents of inheritance. But Bear Island remained, and the Mormonts remained on it, generation following generation, each one learning from the last how to be a Mormont, how to stand when standing was required. There's something almost mythic about this endurance, this continuity across such vast stretches of time. Most houses can't trace their lineage back more than 1,000 years with any certainty. Records are lost, lines die out, families are displaced by conquest or catastrophe. But the Mormonts, on their isolated island, maintained their identity and their position through all the changes and chances of history. Whether this was due to their own strength and skill, or to the simple fact that Bear Island wasn't valuable enough for anyone to seriously contest their control of it, or to some combination of both, we can't really say. But the result was the same, a house that became as permanent as the rocks and trees of the island itself. As we contemplate these distant origins, these shadowy centuries about which we know so little with certainty, we might consider what it means to come from such a place, from such a lineage. To be a Mormont wasn't to be heir to great wealth or power, it was to be heir to a tradition of endurance, to a legacy of standing firm in a hard place. It was to know that your ancestors had fought and died on this same island, that they had faced the same cold winds and the same iron-born raids, that they had stood where you stood and done what needed to be done. There's a weight to that kind of history, but also a strength. You're never alone when you carry such a lineage. The dead stand with you, their example showing you what's possible, what's required, what it means to be worthy of the name you bear. The ancient pattern established in the Age of Heroes, that cycle of raid and defence that shaped the Mormont character, would continue for thousands of years with a regularity that was almost like the seasons themselves. Spring would come to Bear Island, the ice would break up in the harbours, and with the warming of the seas, the Ironborn would come. Summer would see more raids, sometimes several in a single season if the pickings were good and the winds favourable. Autumn brought fewer incursions as the Ironborn prepared for winter. And winter itself, the long cold winters of the north, brought a respite, a time when even the hardy Ironborn couldn't easily cross the treacherous waters of the Sunset Sea. This pattern created a kind of rhythm to life on Bear Island, a cycle of preparation and conflict, rebuilding and waiting. The islanders learned to read the seasons not just for planting and harvest, but for war. They knew that when the ice melted and the first green appeared on the trees, they needed to be ready. Watch posts along the coast would be manned, beacons prepared to carry warning from one end of the island to the other, weapons sharpened and armour repaired. Every able-bodied person, man or woman, knew their role in the defence. Children grew up understanding that the sea could bring death as easily as fish. The Ironborn longships were perfectly designed for this kind of raiding, shallow-drafted vessels that could beach almost anywhere. Fast enough to outrun larger ships, manned by warriors who had trained for sea combat since childhood. The Ironborn could strike at dawn, appearing out of the morning mist like ghosts, be ashore and attacking before the alarm could properly be raised, and be gone again by midday with whatever they had taken. They didn't come to conquer Bear Island, not usually, because holding it would have been difficult, and the island itself wasn't wealthy enough to be worth the effort. They came to reave, to take what wasn't theirs, to prove their prowess and claim glory under the eyes of their drowned god. For the Mormonts and their people, these raids were devastating in ways that go beyond simple military conflict. A raid might kill a dozen people, burn a village, steal the season's stores of food. That meant families destroyed, children left orphaned, communities that had to rebuild from ashes. It meant hunger in the winter because the grain had been taken or burned. It meant fear, the constant awareness that violence could come from the sea at any moment. Generation after generation grew up with this fear, learned to live with it, learned to push it down and keep working, keep living. Because what else could they do? They couldn't leave their island. It was their home, the only home they had. So they stayed, and they endured. The Mormonts developed strategies for dealing with these raids, tactics passed down from lord to lord, refined over centuries of bitter experience. Warning beacons were crucial, great pyres of wood kept ready to be lit on high points along the coast. When raiders were spotted, the beacon would be lit, and the smoke would carry the alarm to the next beacon, and the next, until the whole island knew danger was coming. This gave communities time to gather their valuables, drive their livestock into the forests, send the children to hiding places deep in the woods. It gave warriors time to arm themselves and move toward the threat. The forests of Bear Island were another defensive advantage. The Ironborn were sailors and raiders, comfortable on the deck of a ship or in open combat on a beach, but less skilled in the thick woods where visibility was limited and every tree could hide an enemy. The Mormonts learned to use their forests, to fight from the trees, to ambush raiders who ventured inland, to make every step away from the beach dangerous and uncertain. They knew the island in a way no raider could, knew the paths and the hiding places, the streams and the clearings. This knowledge was a weapon as surely as any sword. They also learned to hide things, to never keep all their supplies in one place. Grain would be stored in multiple locations, some obvious, some hidden. Valuables, such as they were, would be buried or secreted in the forests. Livestock would be scattered rather than concentrated. This way, even a successful raid couldn't take everything, couldn't destroy the community's ability to survive the next winter. It was a strategy born of painful experience, of seeing too many times what happened when raiders found a storehouse full of everything a community needed to survive. The Mormont Keep itself was built with defence in mind. It wasn't a grand castle with soaring towers and delicate architecture. It was a fortress, solid and practical, built from the dark stone of the island and positioned to be defensible from sea attack. The walls were thick, the gates strong, the approach designed so that attackers would be exposed to arrows and stones from above. Inside there were stores enough to withstand a siege, wells for water, space for the people from nearby villages to shelter if a raid was too large to meet in the open. But the Mormonts couldn't always simply defend. Sometimes they had to strike back to punish raiders, to make it clear that attacking Bear Island came with a cost. There are accounts, scattered through the histories, of Mormont lords leading raids of their own against the Iron Islands, of captured iron-born longships being turned against their former owners, of Mormont warriors sailing to the islands themselves to burn and kill in retaliation. These counter-raids were risky, taking the fight to an enemy on their own ground, but they served an important purpose. They showed that the Mormonts weren't simply victims, that they could hurt their enemies as badly as they were hurt. This cycle of raid and retaliation created a kind of grudging respect between the Mormonts and the Ironborn, or so some accounts suggest. The Ironborn valued courage and strength, and the Mormonts demonstrated both. There are even stories, possibly apocryphal, of Ironborn reavers praising the fierceness of Mormont resistance, of raiders specifically seeking out Bear Island because taking anything from it was considered a greater achievement than raiding easier targets. Whether these stories are true or just the kind of legend that grows up around long conflicts, they tell us something about how both sides viewed this centuries-long struggle. The tradition of Mormont women as warriors became deeply embedded during these centuries of conflict. It wasn't just that women could fight if necessary, it was that they were expected to fight, trained from youth just as the men were. A Mormont daughter would learn to wield a weapon as naturally as she learned any other essential skill. This wasn't remarkable on Bear Island, it was simply survival. When raiders came, there was no time to debate whether women should fight. They fought because their homes and children were threatened, because there weren't enough men to defend everything that needed defending, because the choice was fight or die. This created a culture quite different from most of Westeros. In the south, and even in much of the north, a woman who trained with weapons was unusual, worthy of comment, sometimes even scandalous. But on Bear Island, a woman who couldn't defend herself and her household would be the unusual one. The skills of war were simply part of the skills of life, no more remarkable than knowing how to fish or work wood. Over time, this tradition became part of the Mormont identity, something they were known for throughout the north and beyond. There were costs to this way of life, beyond the obvious deaths and destruction of the raids themselves. Living in a constant state of readiness, never quite able to relax, always watching the sea for danger, this takes a psychological toll. The people of Bear Island grew hard, perhaps harder than they needed to be, suspicious of strangers, quick to violence, shaped by the violence that had shaped them. They learned not to trust peace, because peace on Bear Island was always temporary, always waiting to be shattered by sails on the horizon. Children grew up with this hardness, absorbed it as naturally as they absorbed the language and customs of their people. A child on Bear Island learned early that the world was dangerous, that safety was never guaranteed, that you survived by being strong and vigilant. This probably robbed them of some of the innocence that children in safer places might enjoy, but it also prepared them for the realities of their world. A Bear Islander who survived to adulthood was someone who knew how to face danger, how to stand their ground, how to do what needed to be done even when they were afraid. The relationship between House Mormont and the other northern houses was shaped by this role as the North's western shield. The Starks and the other great houses recognised the importance of what the Mormonts did, holding that exposed position, absorbing raids that might otherwise strike deeper into the north. There was respect for this service, and when Bear Island needed help, when a raid was too large for the Mormonts to handle alone, other northern houses would sometimes send aid. Warriors from House Stark or House Glover might sail to Bear Island's defence, Or the Mormonts might be reinforced with men from the mainland during seasons when raids were expected to be particularly heavy. But this help wasn't always available, and the Mormonts learned early that they couldn't depend on rescue. By the time word of a raid reached the mainland and help could be organised and sail to Bear Island, the raiders would usually be long gone. So the Mormonts had to be self-sufficient, had to be able to handle most threats themselves. This made them independent, perhaps even stubborn, used to relying on their own strength rather than on others. They were loyal to House Stark, certainly, but it was a loyalty tempered by the knowledge that when the Ironborn came, they would likely face them alone. There were periods across these long centuries when the Ironborn threat lessened. Political changes on the Iron Islands, wars that occupied the Ironborn elsewhere, shifts in the balance of power that made raiding the north less attractive or more dangerous. During these quieter periods, Bear Island would recover somewhat, the population would grow, improvements could be made to the keep and the villages. But the Mormonts never forgot that the peace was temporary, never let down their guard completely. The weapons were kept sharp, the watchposts manned, the training continued. Because they knew, with the certainty born of bitter experience, that the raiders would come again eventually. Some specific raids stand out in the histories, though the details are often fragmentary and uncertain. There was supposedly a raid during the long winter of what the Maesters call the Winter of the Blue Star, some 3,000 years before Aegon's conquest, when Ironborn raiders found Bear Island depopulated and abandoned, the people having retreated deep into the forests to survive the winter, and the frustrated raiders burned empty villages before sailing home with nothing to show for their effort. There are accounts of a great battle on the beaches of the northern shore, perhaps 1,500 years before the conquest, where a Mormont lord whose name has been lost led a force that destroyed 3 Ironborn longships and killed every raider who had landed, a victory so complete it supposedly deterred raids for a generation. These stories, whether entirely accurate or embellished by time and telling, became part of the Mormont identity. They were lessons about courage and cleverness, about the importance of vigilance, about what could be accomplished when people stood together against overwhelming odds. Parents told these stories to children, lords recited them at feasts, and each generation added their own chapters to the ongoing saga of Bear Island's defence. The cumulative effect of these centuries of conflict was to create a people who were shaped by war but who didn't glorify it. The Mormonts understood the cost of fighting, had buried too many dead, seen too much destruction to romanticize violence. They fought because they had to, because the alternative was slavery or death. Not because they loved battle or sought glory. This gave them a certain grim practicality about warfare. They didn't seek honour in single combat or worry much about fighting fairly. When the Ironborn came, you killed them as efficiently as possible and drove them back to their ships. There was no romance in it, just survival. This attitude would set the Mormonts apart from some of the more chivalrous southern houses, and even from some northern houses that had the luxury of viewing war as an opportunity for glory. The Mormonts knew war as a harsh necessity, something that destroyed communities and killed people who deserved better. They were good at war, certainly, because they had to be, but they didn't love it. They endured it, as they endured the harsh winters and the harsh land, as one more difficult reality of life that couldn't be avoided. The isolation of Bear Island contributed to this distinctive culture. News from the wider world came slowly, trade was limited, and for long periods the islanders had minimal contact with anyone beyond their own shores, and the occasional visitor from the mainland. This isolation allowed Mormont traditions to develop and harden without much outside influence. While the rest of Westeros changed, while the Andals brought new customs to the south, while cities grew and trade networks expanded, Bear Island remained much the same, generation after generation. The isolation was both a strength and a weakness, preserving the Mormont identity, but also perhaps limiting their growth and prosperity. There's something almost timeless about this period of Mormont history, these centuries that blend together because the pattern remained so constant. Lords came and went, each serving their time as the defender of the island, each training their heir to do the same. Ladies managed the keep and the island's meagre economy, raised children to be warriors and survivors, mourned those lost to raids and winters. The common people worked their hard land, fished their cold waters, fought when fighting was needed, and tried to carve out lives of meaning and dignity in difficult circumstances. We should pause and consider what it meant to be one of these common people on Bear Island, someone whose name would never appear in any history, who would live and die on this isolated island without ever seeing the great castles and cities of Westeros. Your life would be hard, certainly, marked by labour and danger, by cold and want. But it would also have its compensations, the fierce pride of community, the knowledge that everyone around you was tested by the same hardships and found strong enough to endure, the satisfaction of work done well in difficult conditions, the bonds created between people who must depend on each other for survival. The beauty of the island itself when you could pause to notice it, the dark forests and rocky shores, the northern lights in winter, the brief bright summers. These people, these forgotten Mormonts and Bear Islanders, they were the foundation on which the house's reputation was built. It's easy to focus on lords and ladies, on the famous names and notable deeds, but history is made just as much by the countless ordinary people who simply keep going, keep working, keep standing despite everything. Every raid that was beaten back by farmers and fishermen who grabbed weapons and fought. Every winter that was survived by families who carefully managed their stores and helped their neighbours when stores ran out. Every generation that was raised by mothers and fathers who taught their children how to be Bear Islanders, how to endure. The relationship with the land itself was complex. Bear Island was harsh, certainly, but it was also home, and the people loved it with the fierce, possessive love that comes from fighting for something. Every rock and tree, every bay and headland, every forest path was known and valued. The island gave them timber and fish, furs, and what meagre crops the soil would support. It gave them a defensible position, thick forests to hide in, shores that made landing difficult for enemies, and perhaps most importantly it gave them an identity. To be from Bear Island was to be part of something distinct, something that had endured for millennia, something worth defending. As we contemplate these long centuries of raid and defence, of endurance and loss, we might consider the question of why. Why did the Mormonts stay on their island? Why not abandon it, move to easier lands on the mainland where the Ironborn couldn't reach, where winters were slightly less harsh and soil slightly more fertile? The answer, as far as we can determine, is that this was their home, and home isn't something you abandon just because it's difficult. Their ancestors had held this island for thousands of years, had bled for it and died defending it. To leave would be to betray that legacy, to admit defeat, to cease being Mormonts in any meaningful sense. There's also the matter of duty to House Stark. The Mormonts held Bear Island for the Starks, as part of their feudal obligation. To abandon the island would be to break faith with their liege lords, to fail in the duty that defined them as a noble house. And the Mormonts, whatever else they were, whatever hardships they endured, were nothing if not dutiful. Loyalty to Stark was woven into their identity as deeply as the tradition of women warriors or the skill at forest fighting. They stood on Bear Island because standing there was their duty, and duty mattered more than comfort or safety. As the centuries rolled on, as the Age of Heroes gave way to later ages, as the world beyond Bear Island changed in ways both large and small, the pattern of Mormont life remained remarkably consistent. The names changed, the specific details varied, but the essential reality stayed the same. Bear Island stood, the Mormonts held it, the Ironborn raided, the Mormonts defended, winter came, the Mormonts endured. It was a cycle that seemed as eternal as the seasons themselves, and perhaps the Mormonts themselves believed it would go on forever, unchanging and unchangeable. But of course nothing in history is truly eternal. The world was changing, even if those changes took centuries to reach isolated Bear Island. The Andals had conquered most of Westeros, bringing new customs and the faith of the Seven. Kingdoms rose and fell. Eventually something would happen that would transform not just Bear Island, but all of Westeros. An event so momentous that it would even penetrate the isolation of the North's most remote holdings. That event was approaching, though the Mormonts of these earlier centuries couldn't know it, couldn't imagine how completely their world was about to change. For now, though, in these ancient times we've been exploring, the pattern held. The Mormonts stood, they fought, they endured. They passed on their traditions and their island to the next generation, and that generation did the same. It was a kind of victory, though not the glorious kind celebrated in songs. It was the victory of simple persistence, of refusing to break no matter how many times you were bent, of standing when standing was the only thing left to do. Here we stand, the Mormont words say, and for thousands of years, across countless raids and endless winters, that's exactly what they did. They stood. The pattern that had defined Bear Island for thousands of years, that cycle of raid and defence that seemed as permanent as the stones themselves, would be disrupted by an event that changed all of Westeros. Aegon Targaryen, called the Conqueror, arrived from Dragonstone with his sisters and his dragons, and set about uniting the Seven Kingdoms under his rule. This was in the year we now call one before the conquest, and the world would never be quite the same afterward. For Bear Island, far from the centres of power where dragons melted castles and armies burned on open fields, the conquest was a distant thing. Something that happened to other people in other places, but its effects would reach even to this remote northern island, changing the context in which the Mormonts lived, even if it didn't immediately change their daily lives. When Aegon's messenger arrived at Winterfell demanding that Torrhen Stark, the king in the north, bend the knee or face dragonfire, the news would have spread throughout the north, reaching even Bear Island eventually. We don't know exactly how the Mormonts learned of these events, whether a raven came from Winterfell or a ship brought word from the mainland, but learn of it they did, and they would have faced a question that many northern houses faced in those days. What would their king do, and what would they do if he chose to fight? Torrhen Stark, as we know from the histories, chose wisdom over pride. He marched south with his army, 30,000 Northmen ready to fight for their independence, but when he saw Aegon's dragons and calculated the odds, he bent the knee rather than see his people burn. This decision earned him the name Torrhen the Kneel King, though in the north it was spoken without shame, as a recognition of the hard wisdom of knowing when a fight cannot be won. The north would remain largely autonomous, keeping its own laws and customs, but it would acknowledge Aegon Targaryen as king and be part of his unified realm. For House Mormont, this change in overlordship was significant in principle, but perhaps less so in practice. They had sworn their loyalty to House Stark, not to the king in the north specifically, and House Stark remained. The Starks were no longer kings, but they were still lords of Winterfell and wardens of the north. Still the house to whom the Mormonts owed fealty. The feudal chain had simply gained another link at the top, a distant king in a new capital called King's Landing. But the relationship between Mormont and Stark remained fundamentally unchanged. Whether any Mormont accompanied Torrhen Stark on his march south, we don't know with certainty. The historical records don't mention individual houses' contributions to that army that never fought. It's possible that a Mormont lord or some of his warriors made that journey, saw the dragons circling overhead, witnessed the moment when their king knelt to a foreign conqueror. Or perhaps Bear Island was too far, the journey too long, and the Mormonts stayed on their island, learning of the conquest only after it was already accomplished. Either way, the result was the same. The north was part of Aegon's 7 kingdoms, and Bear Island was part of the north. One immediate effect of the conquest was what Aegon called the King's Peace. No longer could the great houses wage war on each other without royal permission, The endless feuds and border conflicts that had characterised the Seven Kingdoms for millennia were now forbidden. Lords who had grievances were expected to bring them to the king's justice rather than settling them with swords. This was a revolutionary change, though it would take generations to fully take hold, as old habits die hard, and the king's authority was sometimes more theoretical than actual in distant regions. For Bear Island, the most significant aspect of the King's Peace was how it affected the Ironborn. The Iron Islands were now part of Aegon's realm, just like the North. The Ironborn lords had bent the knee to Aegon, though perhaps with even less enthusiasm than Torrhen Stark had shown, and in theory at least this meant that the Ironborn could no longer raid the North with impunity. If they did, they would be breaking the King's law, rebelling against the Iron Throne itself, and dragons would be the consequence. In practice, of course, the reality was more complicated. The Ironborn culture was built around raiding, around the old way of taking what belonged to others. You can't change a culture with a royal decree, no matter how many dragons enforce it. The raids didn't stop immediately, they just became less frequent, more covert, more likely to be disavowed by the Ironborn lords who officially served the Iron Throne. But the trend was clear. Across the decades and centuries of Targaryen rule, the Ironborn threat to Bear Island diminished, slowly but steadily. This change happened gradually enough that it might not have been obvious to those living through it. A year might pass without a raid, then 2 years, then 5. There would still be occasional attacks, some ambitious Ironborn reaver deciding to test the old ways, some young warrior seeking to prove himself by taking the iron price. But the pattern that had defined Mormont life for thousands of years was breaking down. The sea was becoming, if not safe, at least safer than it had ever been in living memory. For the Mormonts, this shift was both a relief and a challenge. The relief is obvious. Fewer raids meant fewer deaths, less destruction, more stability. Families didn't have to live in constant fear. Children could play near the shore without their parents watching the horizon for sails. The stores of grain and supplies wouldn't be stolen or burned, meaning winters were less harsh, hunger less common. The simple reduction in violence and terror improved life on Bear Island in ways that are hard to overstate. But there was also a challenge, a question of identity and purpose. For thousands of years, the Mormonts had defined themselves largely through their role as defenders against the Ironborn. They were the North's western shield, the house that stood against the raids. The warriors who fought to protect their island and their people. What did it mean to be a Mormont if that defining conflict was fading away? How did you maintain the traditions of vigilance and martial skill when the enemy rarely came? How did you pass on the culture of Bear Island to the next generation when the circumstances that created that culture were changing? These questions didn't have simple answers, and perhaps the Mormonts themselves didn't consciously articulate them. But you can see evidence of them grappling with these issues in how the house developed during the 3 centuries of Targaryen rule. They maintained their warrior traditions even when there were fewer wars to fight. They continued training their women in combat even when raids became rare. They kept watching the sea even when it stayed empty of enemy sails. They held on to their identity even as the world around them changed. The unified realm under the Targaryens brought other changes as well, though again Bear Island's remoteness meant these changes arrived slowly if at all. There was supposed to be a common currency now, the gold dragons and silver stags minted in King's Landing. There was supposed to be a standardized system of justice, with the ability to appeal to the Iron Throne if you felt your local lord had judged you unfairly. There were new institutions like the Kingsguard and the Small Council, new positions of power and influence. But for the common people of Bear Island, most of this probably meant very little. They still used whatever currency they could get, or more often simply bartered, trading fish for grain, furs for tools. They still brought their disputes to their lord at the Mormont Keep, and the lord judged them according to northern custom and tradition. The new royal government was so distant, so removed from their daily lives that it might as well have been on the moon. They knew it existed, knew that technically King Aegon and his descendants were their ultimate overlords, but it didn't change how they lived or what they valued. The broader realm was becoming more connected during this period. Roads were improved, or at least maintained with more consistency. Trade networks expanded. King's Landing grew into a great city, the largest in Westeros, drawing people from all over the realm. There was more movement of people and ideas, more exchange between regions that had previously been quite isolated from each other. But Bear Island, by geography and by choice, remained largely outside these networks. It was too far, too poor, too small to be of much interest to merchants or travellers. The occasional ship might call at the island to trade for timber or furs, but for the most part Bear Island remained as isolated as it had always been. There were moments when the Mormonts were drawn into larger events, though the records are frustratingly sparse about the details. During various Targaryen succession crises and rebellions, the North would be called upon to support the crown or defend against threats, and the Mormonts would contribute what they could. A ship or two with warriors from Bear Island, sworn swords lending their strength to the Stark host. A Mormont son or daughter serving in some capacity away from the island. These moments of engagement with the wider realm were probably significant to those who experienced them. Chances to see more of Westeros, to serve in causes larger than the immediate defence of Bear Island, to prove that the Mormonts were still worthy of their place in the northern hierarchy. But for every Mormont who left the island for adventures elsewhere, dozens more spent their entire lives on Bear Island, living much as their ancestors had lived, working the same hard land, fishing the same cold waters, maintaining the same traditions. The great events of Targaryen history, the dance of the dragons that tore the realm apart in civil war, the Blackfire rebellions that threatened Targaryen rule, the various succession crises and royal scandals, all of these probably reached Bear Island as distant news, interesting perhaps, but not immediately relevant to the daily struggle of survival on a harsh northern island. The long peace, broken occasionally by conflicts but generally more stable than the endless warfare of earlier ages, allowed for some development on Bear Island. The population likely grew, though it remained small by any standard, probably never exceeding a few thousand people across the entire island. The Mormont keep was maintained and perhaps improved, made more comfortable if not more grand. Villages might have become more permanent, with better-built homes and more established infrastructure. The forests were logged in a more systematic way, providing timber for export as well as for local use. But the fundamental character of life on Bear Island probably didn't change all that much. It was still a hard place, still isolated, still marked by long winters and short summers, still inhabited by bears in the deep forests and seals on the rocky shores. The people were still tough, still practical, still taught from childhood that survival required strength and vigilance. The women still trained as warriors, even if they fought actual battles less frequently. The culture that had been forged over thousands of years of conflict with the Ironborn remained intact, preserved by choice and by isolation even as the circumstances that created it faded. There's something worth contemplating in this persistence of culture, even when the original reasons for that culture have diminished. The Mormonts could have, over these centuries of peace, become more like other northern houses. They could have allowed the tradition of women warriors to fade, could have softened their harsh ways, could have sought to become wealthier and more comfortable. But they didn't, or at least not to any great degree. They remained distinctively Mormont, held onto their identity even when holding onto it was a choice rather than a necessity. Perhaps this persistence came from pride, a refusal to admit that they had been shaped by their enemies, a determination to be who they were on their own terms. Perhaps it came from wisdom, an understanding that peace is never permanent, that the skills and attitudes that had allowed them to survive for thousands of years might be needed again. Perhaps it came simply from tradition, from the conservative human tendency to do things the way they've always been done, to teach your children what your parents taught you. Whatever the reason, the Mormonts of the Targaryen era remained recognisably Mormont, links in a chain stretching back to the Age of Heroes and forward to whatever future awaited them. The relationship with House Stark remained the defining external relationship for the Mormonts throughout this period. The Starks were no longer kings, but they were still the most powerful house in the north, still the wardens, still the lords to whom every other northern house owed fealty. The Mormonts served the Starks with the same loyalty their ancestors had shown, answering calls to war when they came, paying their taxes, attending on their liege lords when summoned. This service was rarely dramatic or notable enough to enter the historical record in detail, but it was constant, a steady thread of loyalty running through the centuries. There are hints, scattered through various sources, of individual Mormonts who distinguished themselves in service to the Starks during this period. A Mormont warrior who saved a Stark's life in some forgotten battle, a Mormont lady who served as Castellan of Winterfell while the Starks were away, a Mormont advisor who counselled the Lord of Winterfell on some matter of importance. These glimpses suggest that the relationship between the houses was more than just formal feudal obligation, that there was genuine respect and trust between Mormont and Stark, built on centuries of faithful service and never betrayed. The faith of the old gods remained strong on Bear Island throughout the Targaryen period, just as it did throughout the north. The faith of the Seven, which dominated in the south, and which the Targaryens officially supported despite their own Valyrian traditions, never gained much of a foothold in the north, and certainly not on isolated Bear Island. The islanders continued to worship in the old way, before heart trees and in sacred groves following the traditions of the first men. This religious continuity was part of the broader cultural continuity, another way in which Bear Island remained distinctively northern, distinctively itself. The dragons themselves, those magnificent creatures that had made the Targaryen conquest possible, probably never came to Bear Island. There would have been no reason for them to fly so far north, to visit such a remote and insignificant place, but the Mormonts would have known about them, would have heard the stories of Balerion and Vhagar and the others, would have understood that the world now contained powers beyond anything the North had seen before. Perhaps some Mormonts travelling to Winterfell or beyond saw a dragon with their own eyes, felt the heat of dragon fire, understood viscerally the force that now ruled the realm. Or perhaps dragons remained for the Mormonts what they were for most of Westeros, a distant marvel, something real but not immediate, impressive but not relevant to daily life. As the Targaryen dynasty continued, as one king succeeded another on the Iron Throne, as dragons eventually died out and the dynasty itself began its long decline, Bear Island endured. The Mormonts ruled their island, served their Stark overlords, maintained their traditions, and raised each new generation to do the same. There were good years and bad years, competent lords and less capable ones, times of relative prosperity and times of hardship, but the essential pattern held. The house endured. We should pause and appreciate what this endurance across centuries represents. Most houses, most families, most institutions don't last. They rise and fall, appear and disappear, succeed for a time and then fail. The factors that allow something to persist across such vast stretches of time are complex, a mixture of adaptability and stubbornness, of changing when change is necessary and holding firm when it isn't, of luck and skill in equal measure. The Mormonts had these qualities, or developed them, or were granted them by whatever gods watch over such things. The centuries of Targaryen rule were, in retrospect, a kind of golden age for Bear Island, though perhaps the people living through them didn't recognise it as such. Golden age is probably too strong a term, actually, suggesting wealth and ease that the island never possessed. But it was a time of relative peace, of reduced external threats, of stability that allowed for gradual improvement in the conditions of life. The Mormonts and their people were probably better fed, better housed, safer in the year 200 after the conquest than they had been in the year 1 before it. But nothing lasts forever, and the Targaryen peace, such as it was, would eventually break down. The dynasty would fall, destroyed by its own internal contradictions and by the rebellion of great houses who no longer feared dragonfire because there were no more dragons to fear. And when the Targaryens fell, when Robert Baratheon took the Iron Throne with the support of House Stark and others, the North would be drawn into the conflict. Bear Island would be called upon once again to send its warriors to war, to prove its loyalty in blood as well as words. But that crisis was still in the future as the Targaryen centuries rolled on. For now, for these long generations of relative peace and stability, the Mormonts stood on their island, watched their sea, maintained their traditions, and endured. They were perhaps less essential than they had been in earlier ages, when constant iron-born raids made them the vital western shield of the north. But they remained Mormonts, remained true to their house words and their house identity, remained ready for whatever challenges might come. The long peace of the Targaryen era was ending, though those living through the final years of it couldn't know how dramatic the end would be. The world was about to enter another period of upheaval and transformation, another moment when the old order would be shattered and a new one forged. And Bear Island, remote and isolated though it was, would not remain untouched by these changes. The Mormonts would be called upon to choose, to fight, to prove once again that when duty called, they would answer. _quote_2_ their words proclaimed, and they had stood through the Age of Heroes, through the centuries of Ironborn raids, through the Targaryen peace. Now they would stand through whatever came next, because that's what Mormonts did. They stood. If you're finding these contemplative explorations of Westerosi history and politics a peaceful way to end your day, a like and subscribe really helps others discover these gentle journeys through the past. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of those who find comfort in slowly unfolding stories of power and patience, of roses growing strong through centuries of careful cultivation. The long peace that had characterized the Targaryen centuries came to an end in the year 282 after Aegon's conquest, though the signs of trouble had been building for years before that. King Aerys II, called the Mad King, had descended into paranoia and cruelty, alienating the great houses that supported his rule, committing acts of brutality that shocked even a realm accustomed to royal excess. When he demanded that Lord Jon Arryn execute his two wards, Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, for no crime other than being friends of a man the king had already murdered, the realm erupted into rebellion. For Bear Island, news of these events would have come slowly, perhaps weeks or months after they occurred. A raven to Winterfell, then word sent to the various northern houses, explaining that Lord Eddard Stark was calling his banners, that the North would march to war in support of Robert Baratheon's claim to the Iron Throne. The Mormonts, like every other northern house, faced a choice, though it probably didn't feel like much of a choice at all. The Starks had called, and the Mormonts had answered Stark calls for thousands of years. Loyalty wasn't something you questioned or debated. It was simply what you did. The Lord of Bear Island at this time, we don't know his name with certainty, would have begun the familiar process of gathering his strength for war. Men would be called from their fishing and their logging, weapons would be distributed, armour repaired, ships prepared. The women of Bear Island might well have wanted to fight alongside the men, as was their tradition, but this war would be fought far to the south, too far for the entire fighting strength of the island to be sent. Some would have to stay behind to protect Bear Island itself, to maintain the watch, to ensure that the island didn't fall into chaos in the absence of its warriors. How many men Bear Island could contribute to the northern host, we can only estimate. The island's population was small, probably no more than 3,000 or 4,000 people at most, and not all of those were of fighting age or capability. Perhaps the Mormonts mustered 100 warriors, perhaps 200, certainly not more than that. It was a small contribution compared to what the larger northern houses could field, but it was what Bear Island could afford, and it would be given without hesitation or reservation. The journey from Bear Island to the gathering point of the Northern Army would have been the first great adventure for many of these warriors. Most had probably never left the island before, or if they had, only to visit the nearest mainland settlements. Now they were sailing south, then marching with the great host that Lord Eddard was assembling, thousands of Northmen converging on Winterfell and then marching south toward war. The sheer scale of it must have been overwhelming. The noise and chaos of an army on the march, the mixture of excitement and fear that comes with knowing you're heading toward battle. The Mormonts would have brought their own character to this northern host. They were known, even among other northerners, for their fierceness and their endurance, for the fact that their women could fight as well as their men. There might have been some Bear Island women among the warriors who marched south. Though the records don't specifically mention them, it's easy to imagine a Mormont lady, perhaps the Lord's wife or daughter, arguing that she had as much right to fight as any man, that Bear Island's traditions should be honoured even in this foreign war. Whether such arguments prevailed, we simply don't know. The Northern Army marched south through the Neck, that treacherous marshland that guards the approach to the north, and joined with the rebel forces gathering in the Riverlands. Robert Baratheon had raised his own banners, and Jon Arryn had brought the Knights of the Vale, and together with the North they formed a formidable coalition against the Mad King. The war that followed would rage across the realm for the better part of a year, a series of battles and sieges that would determine the fate of the Targaryen dynasty and reshape the political order of Westeros. The Mormont warriors would have fought in these battles, though we don't have detailed accounts of their specific actions. They were part of the northern contingent, fighting under the direwolf banners of House Stark, standing in the shield walls and enduring the charges of loyalist cavalry, holding their positions when other men might have broken. There would have been moments of terror, certainly, moments when dragonfire seemed to fill the sky, even though the Targaryen dragons were long dead, moments when death felt close enough to touch. The Battle of the Trident was the decisive engagement of the war, where Robert Baratheon faced Prince Rhaegar Targaryen in single combat, while the armies clashed around them. The northern forces were there, fighting in the river itself, the waters running red with blood, the sound of steel on steel drowning out even the roar of the current. The Mormonts would have been somewhere in that chaos, fighting and killing and trying not to be killed, doing their duty as they understood it, even as the larger meaning of the battle unfolded beyond their ability to see or influence. When Robert's hammer crushed Rhaegar's chest and the prince fell into the water, when the loyalist forces broke and fled, the Mormonts would have pursued like all the other rebel soldiers, though perhaps with less enthusiasm than some. They were northern, practical, not given to the kind of bloodlust that can seize men in the aftermath of victory. They would have done what was necessary, taken prisoners when possible, killed when they had to, and then stopped when the fighting was over, waiting for orders, wondering what would happen next. The sack of King's Landing came shortly after the Trident, when Lord Tywin Lannister, who had stayed neutral throughout most of the war, suddenly declared for Robert and led his forces to the capital. What happened in King's Landing during the sack was terrible, a violation of the most basic rules of warfare and honour, with women and children murdered, the royal family destroyed, atrocities committed in the name of securing Robert's throne. The northern forces, including the Mormonts, arrived after the worst of it was over, but they saw the aftermath, saw what men could do when restraint was abandoned. Eddard Stark was reportedly sickened by what he saw in King's Landing, by the murder of Rhaegar's children, by the brutality of how the Targaryens had been destroyed. He quarrelled with Robert over it, though they eventually reconciled. The Mormont warriors, looking at the devastation, at the bodies in the streets, might have wondered what kind of war they had fought, what kind of victory this was supposed to be. They had marched south to support their lord, to fight for what they were told was a just cause, and they had done their duty. But the sack of King's Landing showed the dark side of war, the way even righteous causes can be corrupted by violence and ambition. The casualties the Mormonts sustained during the rebellion are not recorded, but there would have been losses. Some Bear Island warriors who marched south never returned home, buried in southern soil far from the forests and shores they had known. Their families would mourn them, would wonder about the specifics of how they died, would try to make meaning out of their loss, Did they die bravely? Did they suffer? Were they alone or surrounded by companions? These questions might never be answered, but they would be asked nonetheless, because that's what the living do when confronted with the death of those they love. When the war ended, when Robert Baratheon was crowned king and the Targaryen dynasty was broken, the surviving Mormonts would have made the long journey back north. They were going home, but they were changed by what they had seen and done. War as that marks people in ways that can't always be seen or articulated. The young warriors who had left Bear Island full of excitement and uncertainty were returning as veterans, as men and women who had seen battle, who had killed other human beings, who had watched friends die. The island they returned to was the same island they had left, but they themselves were different. Lord Eddard Stark returned to the north as well. But not immediately to Winterfell. He brought with him a bastard son, a boy named Jon Snow, whom he claimed to have fathered during the war. The boy's mother, Eddard would never say, taking that secret to his grave and rebuffing all questions about it. This mystery would be a source of speculation throughout the realm, but in the north there was a certain respect for Eddard's privacy, an understanding that a man's honour was his own business. The Mormonts, like other northern houses, would have accepted Jon Snow's existence without prying too deeply into the circumstances of his birth. The new political order established after Robert's rebellion affected Bear Island only indirectly. Robert Baratheon was king now instead of a Targaryen, but for the people of Bear Island this meant very little in practical terms. They still owed their primary loyalty to House Stark, which remained as powerful in the north as it had ever been, perhaps more so given Eddard's close friendship with the new king. The distant king in King's Landing had changed, but the fundamental structure of authority that governed Bear Island's existence remained intact. Eddard Stark's lordship of the north would prove to be a time of stability and relative prosperity. He was a just man, firm but fair, who ruled according to the old ways and the old values. He understood the north and its people, understood the importance of honour and duty, understood that leadership meant service rather than exploitation. For houses like the Mormonts, having such a lord was a blessing, ensuring that their loyalty would be respected and their service valued. The years immediately following the rebellion were spent in recovery and rebuilding. The North had sent thousands of men south, and while it had fared better than some regions in terms of casualties, there were still many families mourning losses, still communities that had to adapt to the absence of men who would never return. Bear Island would have shared in this grief, would have held whatever ceremonies or rituals they used to honour their dead, would have worked to help the widows and orphans left behind by the war. But life goes on, as it always does, and Bear Island needed to return to its normal rhythms. The fishing had to continue, the timber had to be cut, the watch had to be maintained. The island's economy was simple and fragile, unable to sustain extended disruption. So even while mourning their losses, even while processing what they had experienced in the war, the people of Bear Island returned to their work, to the daily tasks that kept their community alive and functioning. There was pride, certainly, in what the Mormonts had done. They had answered their lord's call, had marched to war alongside the greatest houses of the north, had fought in battles that would be remembered for generations. They had proven once again that despite their small size and remote location, they were worthy of their place in the northern hierarchy. When the story of Robert's rebellion was told in later years, the Mormonts could say they had been part of it, had contributed to the victory that changed the realm. The Mormont lord who had led his people to war would have returned with enhanced status, having served Lord Eddard Stark directly, having fought in the great battles of the rebellion. This service strengthened the bonds between the houses, created personal connections and memories of shared hardship that went beyond abstract feudal obligation. When the Mormont lord looked at Lord Eddard, he would see not just his liege lord, but someone he had fought alongside, someone who understood what they had all gone through together. The transition from war to peace is never simple or immediate. Warriors who had spent months in a state of constant vigilance, constant readiness for violence, had to learn again how to live in a world where such vigilance wasn't necessary every moment of every day. Some struggled with this transition, found themselves restless or troubled, unable to settle back into the routines they had known before the war. Others were simply grateful to be home, to be alive, to have the chance to build normal lives again. For the young people of Bear Island who had not gone to war, who had stayed behind to maintain the island's defences and economy, there might have been a mixture of relief and regret. Relief that they had been spared the dangers and horrors of war, certainly, but perhaps also regret that they had missed the great adventure, that they hadn't proven themselves in the way their peers had. This is a common dynamic in the aftermath of wars, the complex feelings of those who served and those who didn't, feelings that can create divisions or understanding depending on how they're handled. The island itself had remained secure during the war years. The Watch maintained no significant threats emerging to test those left behind. This was fortunate because if the Ironborn had chosen that moment to resume their old ways, if they had raided while Bear Island's warriors were far to the south, the consequences could have been devastating. But the peace held, or held well enough, and when the warriors returned home they found their families safe, their island intact, ready to welcome them back. In the broader context of the North, the post-rebellion period was marked by Eddard Stark's marriage to Catelyn Tully, a political alliance that strengthened ties between the North and the Riverlands. Children began arriving at Winterfell, a new generation of Starks who would one day inherit their father's responsibilities and his burdens. The Mormonts would have watched these developments from a distance, as remote vassals do, interested but not directly involved, their connection to these events mediated through layers of feudal hierarchy. The economy of the realm gradually recovered from the disruptions of war. Trade routes reopened, markets stabilised. The normal flow of goods and services resumed. For Bear Island, this meant a return to their traditional exports of timber and furs, their traditional imports of grain and other necessities. The island had never been wealthy, but it achieved a kind of equilibrium, producing enough to sustain its population and meet its obligations without much surplus left over. The religious life of Bear Island continued unchanged by the political upheavals in the south. The old gods were still worshipped in the ancient way, before heart trees and in sacred groves. The faith of the Seven, which had grown stronger in the south during the Targaryen years, and which the new Baratheon dynasty officially supported, remained foreign to Bear Island. A southern thing that had no relevance to northern lives and northern spirituality. This religious continuity was part of the broader cultural continuity that characterized the North, a resistance to change that came from deep respect for tradition, and from the practical understanding that the old ways had allowed them to survive for thousands of years. As the years passed after the rebellion, as the initial excitement and disruption faded into memory, Bear Island settled into a new normal that was very much like the old normal. The Mormonts ruled their island, served their Stark overlords, maintained their traditions, prepared for winters that always came eventually. The great events of the realm, Robert's troubled kingship, the political manoeuvrings in King's Landing, the rise and fall of various powers and factions, all of this was distant, filtered through layers of distance and indifference. But the rebellion had proven something important, had demonstrated that even in an age of relative peace, war could come suddenly, demanding sacrifice and service. The Mormonts had proven themselves ready for that call, had shown that the old loyalty to Stark was not just empty words but a real bond that would be honoured regardless of cost. This was valuable, both in practical terms, ensuring that House Stark could count on Mormont support, and in terms of identity, confirming that the Mormonts were who they believed themselves to be, a house of warriors and faithful servants. The children born on Bear Island in the years after the rebellion grew up hearing stories about the war, about the great battles and the long march south, about the Mormont warriors who had fought alongside the Stark host. These stories became part of the island's history, part of the collective memory that shaped each new generation's understanding of what it meant to be from Bear Island. The veterans would tell their stories, perhaps emphasizing different aspects depending on their audience and their purpose, teaching lessons about courage and duty, about the cost of war and the importance of standing with your lord. As we contemplate this period of Mormont history, this moment when they were called to war and answered that call, we might consider what it means to honour obligations that were made by ancestors long dead, to fight in wars whose causes you might not fully understand, to risk everything because loyalty demands it. The Mormonts didn't debate whether to support the rebellion. They didn't calculate costs and benefits, didn't try to stay neutral or play both sides. They simply did what they had always done, what their house words proclaimed they would always do. They stood. They stood with the Starks, stood in battle, stood through loss and hardship, stood until the war was over and they could return home. This kind of loyalty is increasingly rare in the modern world, where allegiances are often conditional and temporary, where people switch sides based on advantage and opportunity. But in the North, in houses like Mormont, loyalty was something deeper and more enduring. It was part of identity, part of what made you who you were. To betray that loyalty would be to betray yourself, to become someone other than a Mormont, and that was unthinkable. So they stood, as they always had, as they always would, because standing was what Mormonts did. In the years following Robert's rebellion, as Bear Island settled back into its rhythms and the North enjoyed the stability that came with Eddard Stark's just rule, one of the most significant figures in Mormont history was preparing to make a decision that would define the rest of his life and cast a long shadow over his house. Jeor Mormont, who had ruled Bear Island as its lord for many years, was approaching the age when northern lords often begin to think about succession, about ensuring their house's future, about the legacy they will leave behind. What Jeor chose to do was unexpected, perhaps. Though it followed a northern tradition that went back centuries, he decided to take the black to join the Night's Watch and leave Bear Island to his son and heir. The Night's Watch, that ancient brotherhood sworn to guard the wall and defend the realm against whatever threats might come from the lands beyond, had always held a special place in northern consciousness. The north was closer to the wall than any other region, close enough that the threat of wildling raids was real rather than theoretical, close enough that most northern families had sent sons to the Watch at some point in their history. There was a tradition, honoured if not universal, that northern lords in their later years might join the Watch, giving their remaining strength to the realm's defence while allowing their heirs to assume their responsibilities without the complication of an ageing former lord looking over their shoulder. Jeor Mormont's decision to follow this tradition probably came from a mixture of motivations, as most important life decisions do. He was getting older, perhaps feeling the weight of years spent ruling a harsh island in a harsh land, dealing with the endless small crises that make up a lord's daily life. He had an adult son, Jorah, who was ready to assume leadership of the house, who had proven himself capable, who deserved the chance to rule in his own right rather than waiting indefinitely for his father to die. And perhaps Jeor felt the pull of service, the northern understanding that the Watch was important, that manning the wall was a duty that fell particularly heavily on the north, that a life spent in that service would be a life well spent. The process of joining the Watch would have required careful preparation. Jeor would need to settle his affairs, formally pass lordship of Bear Island to Jorah, make arrangements for the transition of authority that would ensure the island's continued stability. There would have been ceremonies, probably simple ones in keeping with northern custom, where Jeor formally stepped down and Jorah formally assumed the lordship. The people of Bear Island would have witnessed this transition, would have said their farewells to a lord who had served them for many years, would have pledged their loyalty to his son and heir. Jeor would have made the journey from Bear Island to the Wall, perhaps sailing to White Harbour and then travelling overland, or perhaps going by ship around the northern coast and approaching the Wall from the east. It was a journey from one edge of the north to another, from an island constantly battered by the Western Sea to the great ice wall that marked the northern boundary of the realm. He was leaving behind everything he had known. His home and his family, the island he had ruled and protected, take on a new life in service to the realm. At Castle Black, the primary fortress of the Night's Watch along the wall, Jeor would have taken his vows before the old gods, as was the northern custom. He would have sworn to take no wife, hold no lands, father no children, to live and die at his post defending the realm. These were serious vows, binding for life, transforming him from Lord Jeor Mormont into simply Jeor of the Night's Watch, a brother among brothers, his past life set aside in favour of this new dedication. The vows didn't erase who he had been, exactly, but they redefined it, made his former lordship just one part of a larger identity now centred on service to the Watch. The Night's Watch that Jeor joined was not what it had been in earlier ages. Once it had been a position of honour, with thousands of men manning the wall, with sufficient resources and respect to fulfil its mission effectively. But over the centuries, as the threats from beyond the wall seemed to diminish, as the realm focused on internal conflicts rather than external dangers, the Watch had declined. Fewer men took the black, and those who did were increasingly criminals and outcasts sent to the wall as punishment, rather than volunteers seeking honour in service. The Watch was underfunded, undermanned, struggling to maintain even a fraction of the fortresses along the wall's immense length. But Jeor brought qualities that the Watch desperately needed. He brought leadership experience, having ruled Bear Island through its challenges. He brought maturity and wisdom, the perspective that comes from years of responsibility. He brought the northern understanding of duty and endurance, the Mormont capacity to stand firm in difficult circumstances. And he brought something else as well, something that would prove significant in the years to come. He brought Longclaw, the ancestral Valyrian steel sword of House Mormont. Longclaw was a treasure, one of the precious few Valyrian steel blades remaining in Westeros. Valyrian steel was forged with techniques lost when Valyria was destroyed in the Doom, techniques involving both physical metallurgy and perhaps magic, creating blades that were lighter and stronger than normal steel, that held an edge indefinitely, that were virtually impossible to break. Such swords were heirlooms of the greatest value, passed down through noble houses for generations, symbols of prestige and markers of ancient lineage. That Jeor brought Longclaw to the wall with him, rather than leaving it on Bear Island for his son, suggests something about his understanding of what the Watch needed, and perhaps about his relationship with Jorah. At the wall, Jeor adapted to his new life with the practicality that had always characterised the Mormonts. He wasn't a young man learning the basics. He was an experienced leader who could contribute immediately to the Watch's efforts. He stood watches on the wall, patrolled the forests south of the wall, participated in rangings beyond it to scout for wildling activity. He learned the specific skills and knowledge required by the Watch, the signs of wildling movement, the dangers that existed in the haunted forest, the peculiar challenges of life at the edge of the world. His fellow brothers in the Watch would have recognised his quality quickly. This wasn't some soft southern lord playing at soldier, nor was it a criminal forced to take the black to avoid worse punishment. This was a man who understood service and duty, who could endure hardship without complaint, who could be counted on when things became difficult. The respect he earned was real, based not on his former lordship but on his present character and conduct. In the Watch, where all men were supposed to be equal regardless of their former lives, this kind of earned respect was the only kind that truly mattered. The years passed, and Jeor rose through the informal ranks of the Watch. The Night's Watch didn't have nobility in the traditional sense, but it had positions of responsibility and authority, and men who proved themselves capable were given these positions. Jeor became a ranger, one of those who ventured beyond the wall to scout and patrol. He learned the lands beyond the wall better than most, learned to track wildlings, learned to survive in conditions that would kill less hardy men. The skills he had learned on Bear Island, the endurance and the practical competence, served him well in this new environment. Eventually, and this speaks to both his capability and the respect his brothers had for him, Jeor Mormont was elected Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. This was the highest position in the Watch, the leader of all the brothers, the man responsible for defending the wall and making the strategic decisions about how best to fulfill the Watch's ancient mission. The election of a Lord Commander was done by all the brothers casting votes, and for Jeor to win this election meant that men from all backgrounds, from the north and the south, from noble houses and the streets of King's Landing, had all agreed that he was the best man for the position. As Lord Commander, Jeor faced enormous challenges. The Watch was desperately undermanned, with fewer than 1,000 men trying to defend a wall that stretched 300 miles and that once had required tens of thousands to properly guard. The fortresses along the wall had mostly been abandoned, with the Watch concentrating its reduced numbers in just 3 or 4 main castles. Resources were always scarce, dependent on the charity of the realm's lords, charity that was increasingly grudging as the Watch's reputation declined, and its mission seemed less urgent. But perhaps the most serious challenge was that the Watch was beginning to encounter things that suggested the old stories, the ancient legends about what existed beyond the wall, might not be entirely legends after all. Rangers were disappearing, not just killed by wildlings, but vanishing without trace, or found in conditions that suggested something worse than human enemies. Wildlings were fleeing south in greater numbers, speaking of shadows and cold things that killed without mercy. The old tales about the others, the White Walkers of legend who had been defeated 8,000 years ago in the Long Night, were being whispered again, though most dismissed such talk as superstition. Jeor took these reports seriously, more seriously than many in the Watch or in the realm at large. His northern background perhaps helped him here, the understanding that the old stories often contained truth, that just because something hadn't been seen in millennia didn't mean it couldn't return. He began preparing the Watch as best he could for threats that most people didn't believe existed, strengthening defences, improving training, trying desperately to recruit more men to the wall. It was frustrating work, trying to prepare for dangers that he couldn't fully articulate or prove, trying to maintain discipline and morale among men who increasingly felt abandoned by the realm they had sworn to defend. His leadership style was firm but fair, much as it had been when he ruled Bear Island. He demanded much of his men, but he demanded no less of himself. He led from the front, didn't ask anyone to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Shared the hardships and dangers that his brothers faced. This kind of leadership earned loyalty, created bonds of respect that went beyond simple obedience to authority. The men of the Night's Watch would follow Jeor Mormont because they trusted him, because they believed he cared about them and about the mission, because he embodied the values the Watch was supposed to represent. The question of his son Jorah and what was happening on Bear Island would have weighed on Jeor during these years, though he probably tried not to let it show. When you take the vows of the Night's Watch, you're supposed to leave your old life behind, to think of yourself as having no family but the Watch itself. But Jeor was human, and Bear Island was his home, and Jorah was his son. He would have received news from the island occasionally, through letters or through travellers who passed by Castle Black. He would have known that Jorah had married, that he was ruling the island, that life continued there without him. Then came news that would have struck Jeor like a physical blow. His son had been caught selling poachers into slavery. This was a crime of enormous magnitude in the north, where slavery was absolutely forbidden, where the very concept was considered abhorrent. Eddard Stark, as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, had no choice but to pass judgment, and the judgment was death. Jorah had fled rather than face execution, had escaped across the narrow sea, choosing exile over justice. And suddenly, House Mormont was in disgrace, its lord a criminal and a fugitive, its reputation stained by dishonourable conduct. For Jeor, this news would have been devastating on multiple levels. There was the personal pain of a father learning that his son had committed a terrible crime, had betrayed the values that Jeor had tried to instill in him, had chosen dishonour over death. There was the grief of knowing that Jorah was alive but lost to him, fled beyond the reach of northern justice, living somewhere across the sea in shame and exile. There was the anger, perhaps, at the waste of it, at the destruction of everything the Mormonts had built over thousands of years, all thrown away for money to please a southern wife. But there was also the question of what this meant for Bear Island and for House Mormont. With Jorah fled and condemned, who would rule the island? Jeor had taken vows that prevented him from returning to his former position, from reclaiming his lordship even if he wanted to. The Night's Watch was his life now, his responsibility, and he couldn't abandon it. The solution, it turned out, was that lordship of Bear Island would pass to Jeor's sister, Jeor Mormont, an unusual arrangement but one that fit with Bear Island's traditions of women in leadership. Jeor would prove more than capable of the role, would rule the island well and restore its honour, but Jeor wouldn't have known that immediately when the news first reached him. The disgrace of his house must have weighed heavily on Jeor, even as he continued to fulfil his duties as Lord Commander. Here was a house with a history stretching back thousands of years, a house that had never wavered in its loyalty to Stark, that had stood firm through every challenge. And now it was disgraced by his son's crime. Some might have collapsed under this burden, might have lost themselves in grief or anger or shame. But Jeor was a Mormont, and Mormonts endured. He stood, continued his work, bore the pain privately while maintaining his public responsibilities. The one tangible connection to his past that Jeor had brought with him to the Wall was Longclaw, the Valyrian steel sword of House Mormont. Some men might have sent the sword back to Bear Island to ensure that the house retained its greatest treasure despite the Lord's disgrace, but Jeor kept the sword, perhaps because it had become more than just a symbol of House Mormont to him, perhaps because he had brought it to serve the Watch rather than to preserve for his house, perhaps because sending it back would have felt like an acknowledgement that his son had any right to it after what he had done. In time, Jeor would give Longclaw to Jon Snow, the bastard son Eddard Stark had brought back from the war, who had come to the Wall to join the Night's Watch. The circumstances of this gift, the relationship between Jeor and Jon, the significance of passing a Valyrian steel sword from one house to someone outside that house entirely, all of this is another story, one that belongs to Jon Snow's history more than to the Mormonts. But the fact that Jeor could let go of Longclaw, could give away his house's greatest treasure to someone he judged worthy, tells us something about his character and his priorities. The Watch mattered more than family pride, service mattered more than inheritance, duty mattered more than tradition. As Lord Commander, Jeor became increasingly convinced that something terrible was stirring beyond the Wall, that the ancient enemy was returning, that the Watch's true test was approaching. He organised a great ranging, taking a large portion of the Watch's fighting strength beyond the Wall to investigate the wildling movements and to search for evidence of what was really happening in the far north. This was a bold decision, a gamble that risked the Watch's limited strength in pursuit of knowledge and proactive defence rather than simply manning the Wall and waiting for threats to come to them. The difficulties Jeor faced as Lord Commander were immense and largely thankless. He was trying to prepare for a threat that most of the realm didn't believe existed, with resources that were never adequate, with men who were often the dregs of society rather than dedicated warriors, in an institution that the realm had largely forgotten and abandoned. The fact that he persisted, that he continued to do his duty year after year despite the difficulties and disappointments, despite the personal grief of his son's disgrace, speaks to the strength of his character and the depth of his commitment. There's something worth contemplating in Jeor Mormont's choice to join the Night's Watch in the first place, and in how he conducted himself once there. He could have remained on Bear Island, could have ruled until natural death took him, could have spent his later years in whatever comfort the island could provide. Instead, he chose service, chose to spend his remaining years in one of the hardest, most thankless positions in the realm. And when personal tragedy struck, when his son's crime brought disgrace to his house, he didn't abandon his post or his responsibilities. He endured, he stood, he continued to serve. This kind of dedication, this willingness to put duty above personal comfort or even personal grief, was deeply northern, deeply Mormont. It was the same quality that had allowed the house to endure for thousands of years on their harsh island. The same strength that had let them stand against ironborn raids century after century. Jeor had brought that Mormont endurance to the wall, had given it to the Watch, had embodied it in his service as Lord Commander. Whether the realm appreciated it or even noticed, it was irrelevant. The service mattered because it needed to be done, because someone had to do it, and Jeor Mormont was someone who did what needed to be done. In the isolation of Castle Black, in the cold that never fully left, even in summer, in the constant vigilance required of those who defend the wall, Jeor Mormont stood his watch. He was hundreds of miles from Bear Island, separated from his home not just by distance, but by the vows that had transformed him from a lord into a brother of the Night's Watch. But the qualities that had made him a Mormont, the endurance and the loyalty and the capacity to stand firm in difficult places, these travelled with him. These were what he gave to the Watch, what he embodied in his service, what he would hold to until the very end. The North remembered Jeor Mormont, or at least those who knew the Watch remembered him. He was respected as a Lord Commander who took his responsibilities seriously, who tried to prepare the Watch for the challenges it faced, who maintained the ancient mission even when the rest of the realm had largely forgotten why it mattered. In the annals of the Night's Watch, which stretched back thousands of years through hundreds of Lord Commanders, Jeor Mormont would be remembered as one of the capable ones, one of the leaders who served with honour and dedication during difficult times. And on Bear Island, though he was gone and couldn't return, though his son had disgraced the house and fled into exile, Jeor's legacy remained. He had shown that a Mormont could leave the island, could serve the realm in a different capacity, could bring honour to the house even far from home. He had demonstrated the values that the house claimed to embody, had proved that duty and service mattered more than comfort or ease. And he had given Longclaw, the house's greatest treasure, to the Watch, and eventually to Jon Snow, creating connections and relationships that would matter in ways he couldn't have predicted when he made that gift. As we contemplate Jeor Mormont's service at the Wall, his years as Lord Commander, his dedication to a mission that most of the realm had forgotten, we might consider what it means to serve faithfully in obscurity, to do essential work that goes unrecognised and unrewarded. The Wall stood, year after year, century after century, defended by men like Jeor Mormont, who asked for nothing but the chance to fulfil their duty. The realm slept safely, mostly unaware that it was safe because of the Watch, because of the men in black who stood their watch through the long night. Jeor Mormont was one of these men, and his service, quiet and unglamorous as it was, mattered more than most would ever know. While Jeor Mormont was serving with honour at the Wall, his son Jorah was writing a very different chapter in the Mormont story, one marked by poor choices and their terrible consequences, by exile and longing, by a fall from grace that would cast a shadow over both the man himself and the house he had disgraced. To understand what happened to Jorah Mormont, we need to go back to before the disgrace, to the young man who seemed destined for a normal, honourable life as Lord of Bear Island, and trace the path that led him from that promising beginning to a shameful end. Jorah Mormont was born on Bear Island, raised in the harsh traditions of his house, taught from childhood what it meant to be a Mormont. He learned to fight, as all Bear Islanders did, learned to endure cold and hardship, learned the history and values of his house. He was the heir, the son who would one day rule the island after his father, and he was prepared for that role as thoroughly as the island's limited resources and his father's wisdom could manage. By all accounts, he was a capable young man, strong and skilled, someone who seemed likely to be a good lord when his time came. When Robert's rebellion called the North to war, Jorah would have been among the Mormont warriors who marched south. He would have fought in the battles that decided the fate of the realm, would have stood in the shield wall at the Trident, would have seen the chaos and terror of war. He survived these battles, returned home to Bear Island, and eventually became lord when his father chose to join the Night's Watch. The transition of power seems to have been smooth, with Jeor confident that his son was ready for the responsibilities of lordship. But then came the tournament at Lannisport, and everything changed. This was in the year 289 after Aegon's conquest, a grand tournament held to celebrate the victory of King Robert's forces against the Greyjoy rebellion. Lords and knights from across the realm gathered at Lannisport to compete in jousting and melee, to display their martial prowess, to seek honour and glory in controlled combat rather than actual war. Jorah Mormont, perhaps seeking to prove himself among the greater lords of the realm, perhaps simply seeking adventure beyond the confines of Bear Island, attended this tournament. And there, unexpectedly, impossibly, Jorah won the tournament's main joust. He unhorsed knight after knight, defeated opponents who were wealthier and more famous, who had better armour and better horses, who should by all rights have beaten this northern lord from a minor house. But Jorah fought well that day, or perhaps luck favoured him, or perhaps the other competitors underestimated him, and when the final tilt was run, Jorah Mormont stood as the champion. It was a moment of triumph, a validation, proof that a Mormont could compete with anyone in the realm. But triumph has a way of leading to tragedy, and Jorah's victory brought him something more dangerous than defeat ever could have. Among the spectators at the tournament was a young woman named Lynesse Hightower, daughter of one of the most ancient and noble houses in the realm. House Hightower ruled Old Town, the oldest and perhaps most sophisticated city in Westeros, a place of wealth and learning and culture far beyond anything Bear Island could offer. Lynesse was beautiful, accustomed to luxury, raised in comfort and refinement. Jorah, flushed with victory and perhaps dazzled by this beautiful southern lady, who represented a world so different from his own, asked Lynesse for her favour in the tournament. She gave it, and when he won, when he was crowned champion, it must have seemed like something from a song, like a story where the worthy knight wins both glory and the lady's love. Jorah courted Lynesse, and perhaps caught up in the romance of the moment, perhaps flattered by the attention of a tournament champion, perhaps not fully understanding what life with him would actually mean. Lynesse agreed to marry him. This marriage, which began in romance and hope, would prove to be the beginning of Jorah's downfall. It wasn't that Lynesse was a bad person exactly, or that Jorah didn't genuinely love her. The problem was simpler and more tragic than that. Lynesse was utterly unsuited for life on Bear Island, and Jorah was unable to give her the life she had been raised to expect. The mismatch between what she wanted and what he could provide would destroy them both, though in different ways. Bear Island was cold, remote, harsh, poor. The Mormont keep was solid and defensible but simple, without the comforts and luxuries that Lynesse had known in Old Town. There were no great feasts, no sophisticated entertainment, no fine clothes or jewels or the social life of a great city. There was work, constant and hard, the daily struggle of maintaining a community on an unforgiving island. The people were rough and practical, shaped by their difficult environment, very different from the refined southern lords and ladies Lynesse had known. Lynesse tried, perhaps, to adapt to her new life. We should be charitable and assume she made some effort to be a good lady of Bear Island, to fulfill the role she had taken on when she married Jorah. But she was miserable, desperately unhappy in this cold place so far from everything she had known. She missed Old Town, missed her family, missed the warmth and the culture and the comfort, and she let Jorah know of her unhappiness, perhaps not cruelly but simply honestly, and her unhappiness became his burden to bear. Jorah loved his wife, or was infatuated with her, or perhaps couldn't separate the two. He wanted to make her happy, wanted to give her the life she deserved, wanted to be worthy of the beautiful southern lady who had agreed to marry him. But he was lord of Bear Island, and Bear Island was poor. The island's economy was based on timber and fishing and furs, modest exports that brought in modest income. There was no great wealth to be had, no way to transform the island into something it wasn't. Jorah was trapped between his love for Lynesse and the reality of his responsibilities and resources, so he began to spend money he didn't have, trying to give Lynesse at least some approximation of the life she'd known. He brought in luxuries from the south, fine clothes and furnishings, delicacies and wines. He held feasts that Bear Island couldn't really afford, trying to create moments of celebration and refinement in the midst of the island's harsh reality. He went into debt, borrowing from moneylenders, mortgaging the island's future to pay for its present, digging himself deeper and deeper into a hole that he couldn't see any way out of. The debts mounted. The creditors demanded payment. And Jorah, desperate and foolish, made a decision that would define the rest of his life and destroy his honour forever. He took poachers, men who'd been caught hunting on his lands without permission, and instead of punishing them according to northern law, he sold them to a passing slave ship. He took free men and sold them into slavery, exchanging their freedom and perhaps their lives for the money he needed to maintain the lifestyle that made his wife happy. Slavery was absolutely forbidden in Westeros, considered one of the vilest crimes imaginable. It was particularly abhorrent in the north, where the memory of being conquered was still relatively fresh in historical terms, where freedom was valued above almost everything else. To sell a man into slavery was to commit a crime against every value the North held dear, against every principle that made northern society function. And Jeor Mormont, Lord of Bear Island, heir to a house that had stood for thousands of years, had done exactly that. When the crime was discovered, when word reached Eddard Stark at Winterfell that one of his lords had been selling people into slavery, there could be only one response. Eddard was known throughout the realm for his rigid sense of honour and justice, for his unwillingness to compromise on fundamental principles. He had no choice, really, even if he had wanted one. The law was clear, the crime was unforgivable, and justice had to be done. Eddard pronounced sentence. Jorah Mormont was condemned to death, to be executed for his crime. But Jorah didn't face his execution. Perhaps Lyness convinced him to run. Perhaps he convinced himself that exile was better than death. Perhaps he simply couldn't bring himself to face the headsman's block and the disgrace. Whatever his reasoning, Jorah fled. He and Lyness escaped Bear Island, made their way to a port and sailed across the narrow sea to the free cities of Essos, beyond the reach of Westerosi justice. He chose exile over honour, chose life as a fugitive over death as a condemned criminal. This flight completed Jorah's disgrace. If he had stayed, if he had faced his execution with courage and accepted the consequences of his actions, there might have been some redemption in that, some honour in dying bravely for his crimes. But by running he added cowardice to his list of failures. He became not just a criminal, but a fugitive. Not just a man who had made terrible choices, but one who wouldn't even face the consequences of those choices. His name became a shame to House Mormont, a stain on a reputation built over thousands of years. In Essos, in the free cities where slavery was legal and common, where no one cared about northern honour or Westerosi law, Jorah tried to build a new life with Lyness. But the money he had gained from his crime didn't last long. And Lyness's happiness didn't last much longer. The sources are unclear about exactly what happened, but it seems that eventually Lyness left him, perhaps for a wealthier patron who could give her the luxury she craved, perhaps simply because the romance had died and all that was left was a disgraced exile and his increasingly desperate circumstances. Jorah found himself alone in Essos, exiled from his home, separated from his wife, his honour destroyed, his name disgraced. He had lost everything that mattered, lost it through his own choices, through his inability to accept what he had and his desperate attempts to be something he wasn't. The tournament champion who had won the beautiful lady's favour had become a homeless exile, wandering the free cities, trying to survive, trying to find some purpose or meaning in a life that had become almost unrecognisable from what it had once been. He became a sellsword, selling his skills with blade and lance to whoever would pay. This was common enough in Essos, where the free cities constantly warred with each other and where companies of sellswords hired themselves out to the highest bidder. Jorah had the skills, certainly, had been trained as a warrior from childhood, had fought in Robert's Rebellion and proven himself capable. but being a sellsword was a far cry from being Lord of Bear Island, and the work was brutal and dirty, morally ambiguous at best, fighting in other people's wars for pay rather than for any cause he believed in. There are fragmentary accounts of Jorah serving with various sellsword companies during this period. He may have been with the Second Sons for a time, or with other companies whose names have been lost to history. He fought in the constant small wars that plagued Essos, the trade disputes, and succession conflicts and territorial ambitions that kept the free cities in a state of perpetual low-level warfare. He survived, which was more than many sellswords could say, but survival without honour or purpose is its own kind of death. Through all of this, through all the years of exile and wandering, Jorah apparently never stopped thinking about home. Bear Island remained in his memory, a place of cold beauty and harsh honour that he had thrown away through his own foolishness. He had disgraced his house, betrayed everything his father had tried to teach him, destroyed his own future and the reputation his ancestors had built. The weight of this knowledge must have been crushing, a burden he carried every day in his exile. Some accounts suggest that Jorah eventually entered the service of Daenerys Targaryen, the last surviving member of the dynasty that Robert's rebellion had overthrown, who was living in exile in Essos with dreams of reclaiming her throne. If these accounts are accurate and the sources are uncertain, it would add another layer of complexity to Jorah's story. Here was a man who had fought in the rebellion that destroyed the Targaryens, now serving the last Targaryen, perhaps seeing in her cause some chance at redemption, some way to matter again after years of meaningless wandering. But even if he found new purpose in Targaryen service, even if he proved himself valuable and loyal in that service, it couldn't erase what he had done. The crime remained, the disgrace remained, the exile remained. He was still Jorah the Andal, as some called him in Essos, still the disgraced Northern Lord who had sold men into slavery and fled rather than face justice. Whatever honour he might earn in his new life couldn't restore the honour he had lost in his old one. The tragedy of Jeor Mormont is not that he was evil or deliberately cruel, but that he was weak when strength was required, that he valued the wrong things, that he made terrible choices in pursuit of an impossible dream. He loved a woman who couldn't love him back, not really, not in a way that could survive the reality of who he was and what he could offer. He tried to be something he wasn't, tried to give her a life that Bear Island couldn't support, and in doing so he betrayed everything that being a Mormont meant. There's a philosophical question worth considering here, about the relationship between love and duty, between personal happiness and honour. Jorah chose love, or what he thought was love, over duty. He chose trying to make Lyness happy over maintaining his honour and serving his people properly, and the result was the destruction of both the love and the honour, leaving him with nothing. Would it have been better if he had never won the tournament, never met Lyness, never been tempted away from the path his father and his ancestors had walked? Perhaps, but we can't know. We can only observe the consequences of the choices he did make. For House Mormont, Jorah's disgrace was a wound that would take time to heal. The house that had never wavered in its loyalty, that had stood firm for thousands of years, was now associated with slavery and cowardice, with a lord who had betrayed his duties and fled from justice. Jeor Mormont, serving at the wall, would have felt this shame deeply, even as he tried to maintain his focus on his duties as Lord Commander. The people of Bear Island would have felt it too. The knowledge that their lord had dishonoured them had made their house name a source of shame rather than pride. But houses, like people, can endure disgrace and eventually recover from it, if they're strong enough, and if those who come after the disgrace are worthy. Mage Mormont, Jorah's sister who assumed leadership of Bear Island after Jorah's flight, would have the task of restoring the house's honour, of proving that one man's failure didn't define the entire house, that the Mormont tradition of service and strength could continue despite this terrible interruption. Her success in this task is another story, one we'll return to, but the challenge she faced was enormous. As for Jorah himself, wandering in exile in Essos, carrying the weight of his crimes and his losses, We might feel a measure of pity even while acknowledging the justice of his punishment. He made terrible choices, certainly, choices that hurt innocent people and destroyed his own honour. But he was also a man trapped between impossible demands. A northern lord trying to satisfy a southern wife, a man of modest means trying to provide luxury, someone shaped by one set of values who fell in love with someone shaped by entirely different values. The tragedy was perhaps inevitable once he made that first choice, once he decided that Lyness's happiness mattered more than his duty. The bear of House Mormont is a fierce creature, strong and enduring, but Jorah proved to be something less than the bear his house revered. He was weak where he should have been strong, dishonest where he should have been honourable, cowardly where he should have been brave. His story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to be something you're not, about the importance of accepting your responsibilities and limitations, about what happens when personal desire overwhelms duty and honour. In the long history of House Mormont, stretching back thousands of years through countless lords and ladies, Jorah Mormont stands as the failure, the one who broke the pattern, the disgrace. But even this disgrace tells us something about the house and its values. The very fact that his crime was considered so terrible, that it resulted in such complete condemnation, shows how seriously the Mormonts took their responsibilities, how deeply they valued honour and duty. A house with lower standards might have overlooked his crime, might have protected him from justice. But the Mormonts, and the North more broadly, couldn't accept what he had done, couldn't let it pass unpunished. And so Jorah remained in exile, carrying his shame across the free cities, longing for a home he could never return to, serving causes that weren't his own, living a half-life in the shadows of Essos, while his name remained a source of pain and disgrace on Bear Island. He had thrown away his inheritance, his honour, his place in a story thousands of years old, and all he had to show for it was bitter experience and the memory of mistakes that couldn't be unmade. The bear who couldn't stand, who fell when he should have remained firm, who proved that even ancient houses can produce failures if the individual is weak enough or foolish enough or unlucky enough in love. While Jorah wandered in exile and Jeor stood his watch at the wall, Bear Island itself needed leadership, needed someone to restore the house's honour and prove that one man's failure didn't define House Mormont. That responsibility fell to Jeor Mormont, Jeor's sister, who became Lady of Bear Island in the wake of her nephew's disgrace. Jeor was already a grown woman when she assumed this role, already shaped by Bear Island's harsh traditions, already proven in the ways that mattered on the island. She had daughters of her own, strong girls raised in the Mormont tradition of women warriors, and together they would write a new chapter in the house's history. Jeor's rule of Bear Island restored stability to a house that had been shaken by scandal. She was capable and practical, understanding both the island's limitations and its strengths, knowing how to manage the modest economy and maintain the traditions that defined Mormont identity. Under her leadership, Bear Island continued much as it always had. The timber was cut and traded, the fish were caught and salted, the watch was maintained against threats that rarely came anymore, but that couldn't be forgotten. The island endured, and with it the house's reputation slowly began to recover from the stain Jorah had left upon it. Jeor had 5 daughters, a remarkable number for any family, and even more remarkable was that she raised them all to be warriors in the fullest Bear Island tradition. Their names were Daisy, Alysanne, Lyra, Jorel, and Lyanna, and each of them learned from childhood how to fight, how to endure hardship, how to stand firm when standing was required. The 3 eldest, Daisy, Alysanne, and Lyra, were grown women by the time the War of the Five Kings began. The 2 youngest, Jorel and Lyanna, were still children, but even they were being trained in the ways that would make them formidable when they came of age. Daisy Mormont, the eldest daughter, was particularly notable. She was tall and strong, skilled with weapons, someone who could fight as well as any man and better than most. She embodied everything the Mormont tradition represented. The fierce loyalty and the physical courage, the practical competence and the refusal to be limited by what others expected of women. In a different house, in a different part of Westeros, a woman like Dacey might have been considered strange or unsettling. But on Bear Island she was simply a Mormont, and that was sufficient. The years of Maegor's rule before the war were quiet ones, or as quiet as life on Bear Island ever was. The great events of the realm, King Robert's increasingly troubled rule, the political manoeuvring in King's Landing, the tensions building between the great houses, all of this was distant from Bear Island, filtered through layers of geography and indifference. The Mormonts served House Stark, maintained their island, raised their children, and prepared for winters that always came eventually. It was the kind of ordinary, unremarkable existence that forms the foundation of any society, the quiet work that allows communities to persist across generations. Then, in the year 298 after Aegon's conquest, everything changed. King Robert Baratheon died under suspicious circumstances. His supposed heir, Joffrey Baratheon, was revealed to be the product of incest between Queen Cersei and her brother Jaime Lannister, not Robert's son at all. The realm fractured as various claimants emerged, each declaring himself the rightful king, and in the north, when Eddard Stark was executed in King's Landing by the false King Joffrey, the northern lords declared Eddard's son Robb to be king in the north, reviving the old title that had disappeared when Torrhen Stark bent the knee to Aegon Targaryen 3 centuries earlier. For House Mormont the choice was simple and immediate. Robb Stark had called his banners, and the Mormonts would answer. There was no debate, no calculation of advantage, no attempt to stay neutral or wait to see how events unfolded. The Starks had called, and loyalty demanded an answer. Maege Mormont began gathering her strength, mustering the fighting men and women of Bear Island for war. The island couldn't send as many warriors as the larger northern houses could, perhaps 60 or 70 men at most, but what they sent was of the highest quality. These were Bear Islanders, hard people from a hard place, warriors who had been training since childhood, who understood endurance and loyalty, who would stand firm when others might break. And among them were Maege herself and her eldest daughter Dacey, 2 Mormont women marching to war alongside the men, embodying the traditions that made their house distinctive. The journey from Bear Island to Winterfell and then south with Robb's army would have been transformative for those making it. Most had probably never travelled so far from home, had never seen the wider world beyond their island, and perhaps a few mainland settlements. Now they were marching with thousands of other Northmen, part of an army larger than anything most of them had imagined, heading south to war against the power of the Iron Throne itself. The scale of it must have been overwhelming. The noise and confusion of a great host on the march, the mingling of warriors from different houses, each with their own traditions and identities. Maege Mormont proved to be a valuable presence in Robb's councils. She was older than many of the other lords, experienced in leadership, unafraid to speak her mind. Her perspective was valued, her counsel was sought, and she became one of Robb's trusted advisors. This was significant, a demonstration that the young king in the north respected capability over gender, that he recognised the worth of the Mormont tradition even if it was unusual by Westerosi standards. Maege's presence at those councils helped restore the reputation of her house, showed that Jorah's disgrace hadn't destroyed the Mormont ability to serve with honour. Dacey became one of Robb's personal guard, one of the warriors who stood closest to the king, who would protect him with their lives if necessary. This was a position of great trust and honour, given only to those Robb believed absolutely reliable. That he chose Dacey, a woman from a minor northern house, speaks to both her capability and to Robb's own character, his willingness to value merit over tradition, to see people for what they were rather than what convention said they should be. The Mormont warriors fought in the battles of Robb's campaign, though the specific details of their participation are often lost in the larger narratives of those conflicts. They were at the Whispering Wood, where Robb's forces ambushed and destroyed a Lannister army, capturing Jaime Lannister himself. They marched through the Riverlands, fought at Oxcross and other engagements, where Robb's Northern and Riverlander forces won victory after victory against the Lannisters. They proved themselves in combat, showed that Bear Island still produced warriors worthy of their house's reputation. But wars are not won by battlefield victories alone, and the political situation facing Robb Stark was impossibly complex. He was fighting the Lannisters in the south, while trying to hold together an alliance of Northern and Riverlander houses, each with their own interests and concerns. The Iron Islands had declared independence and were raiding the northern coasts. Stannis Baratheon and Renly Baratheon were both claiming the Iron Throne, further complicating the already tangled politics of the realm. And Robb, for all his tactical brilliance, was still a very young man trying to navigate challenges that would have tested the wisest and most experienced ruler, Jeor Mormont and Galbar Glover, another of Robb's trusted lords, were eventually sent on a secret mission to Greywater Watch, the hidden seat of House Reed in the Neck. The purpose of this mission was apparently to seek the support of the Crannog men, those mysterious swamp dwellers who were among the North's most loyal but least understood vassals, and possibly to make contact with Howland Reed, who had fought alongside Eddard Stark during Robert's rebellion, and who might have valuable counsel to offer the young king. This mission took Mage away from Robb's main army, sent her into the treacherous marshes of the Neck where few outsiders could navigate safely. The Crannog men knew their swamps intimately, could move through them on secret paths, could hide entire settlements in the maze of waterways and islands. Greywater Watch itself was said to move, never in the same place twice, protected by the geography and by the Crannog men's knowledge of their homeland. It was a dangerous journey, and one that would prove fateful in ways that perhaps neither Mage nor Robb could have anticipated. While Mage was in the Neck, while she was separated from the main northern army and unable to protect her king, disaster struck. Robb Stark attended a wedding at the Twins, the fortress of House Frey, believing he was there to reconcile with Lord Walder Frey and secure the alliance he needed. But it was a trap, arranged by the Freys and the Boltons in conspiracy with the Lannisters. At what would become known as the Red Wedding, Robb was murdered along with his mother Catelyn, and much of the Northern army was massacred in one of the greatest betrayals in Westerosi history. Daisy Mormont died at the Red Wedding. She was among those killed in the initial assault, cut down while trying to defend her king, dying in the blood-soaked halls of the Twins far from home, far from Bear Island and the cold northern seas. Her death was part of a larger tragedy, the destruction of the northern cause and the murder of thousands. But for House Mormont it was a personal loss, the death of Mage's eldest daughter, a warrior who had proven herself worthy of the Mormont name, and who had given her life in service to her king. The news of the Red Wedding would have reached the north slowly, in fragments and rumours that gradually coalesced into terrible certainty. The king was dead, the northern army was destroyed, the cause was lost. For those who'd remained on Bear Island, for Mage's younger daughters and the people of the island, this news would have been devastating. So many had marched south with such hope, such determination to support their king and avenge the injustices done to House Stark. And now they were dead, betrayed under the sacred laws of hospitality, murdered at a wedding feast. Mage's own fate after the Red Wedding is uncertain, lost in the chaos and confusion of that terrible time. She was in the Neck when the massacre occurred, separated from the main army, and the historical record simply loses track of her after that point. Some accounts suggest she was killed trying to return north, perhaps ambushed by Frey or Bolton forces. Others suggest she survived and remained in hiding in the Neck, protected by the Crannog men, waiting for a chance to continue the fight against the traitors who had destroyed her king. The most likely truth, though we can't know with certainty, is that Jeor Mormont died somewhere in the aftermath of the Red Wedding, either killed in the fighting or succumbing to wounds or hardship in the chaos that followed. She disappears from the historical record, and a woman as capable and as loyal as Jeor would not have simply hidden if she had been able to continue fighting. Her death, like so many deaths in that terrible period, probably went unrecorded and unmourned except by those who knew and loved her personally. For Bear Island, the losses of the War of the Five Kings were catastrophic in proportion to the island's small population. Dozens of warriors who had marched south never returned. Dacey was dead. Confirmed. Killed at the Red Wedding. Mage was missing and presumed dead. The island's fighting strength had been gutted, its leadership destroyed. And yet the island endured, because that's what Bear Island did. The survivors returned home, the community rallied around those who remained, and life continued even in the shadow of terrible loss. The North itself was devastated by the Red Wedding and its aftermath. House Bolton, having betrayed and murdered their king, were installed as wardens of the North by the Iron Throne, ruling from the Dreadfort and later from Winterfell itself. The Boltons were hated, feared. Their rule maintained by terror and by the backing of the Lannister regime in King's Landing. For houses that had supported Robb Stark, for loyal northern houses like the Mormonts, this was a time of occupation and oppression, of keeping your head down and surviving until better times might come. On Bear Island, with Mage gone and Dacey dead, leadership would have fallen to the next generation. Alysanne Mormont, the second daughter, was grown and capable, trained in the same traditions as her mother and elder sister. But there was also Lyanna, the youngest daughter, who was still a child, perhaps 10 years old at most when the Red Wedding occurred. The exact succession on Bear Island during this chaotic period is unclear from the historical record, but somehow the house maintained itself, kept the island functioning, preserved the Mormont identity through yet another crisis. The grief on Bear Island must have been profound and pervasive. So many families had lost fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. The Mormont family itself had lost its lady and its heir, had seen its strength broken in a war that had ended in betrayal and disaster. The house that had stood for thousands of years, that had survived Ironborn raids and harsh winters and the slow grind of time, now faced perhaps its greatest test, maintaining its identity and its purpose in the wake of catastrophic loss. But grief, however deep, couldn't be allowed to paralyse the island. Work still had to be done, fish still had to be caught, timber still had to be cut, the watch still had to be maintained. Life on Bear Island had always been hard, had always required pushing through difficulty and loss, and the survivors knew how to endure. They mourned their dead, certainly, held whatever ceremonies their traditions demanded, spoke the names of those who had fallen and honoured their service, but then they returned to work because work was how you survived, how you honoured the dead by continuing to live. The political situation in the North during the Bolton period was complex and dangerous. Houses that remained loyal to the memory of the Starks, that had not betrayed their king, were viewed with suspicion by the new regime. The Boltons demanded oaths of fealty, demanded support for their rule. And the price of refusal could be brutal. Smaller houses like the Mormonts had to navigate carefully, had to find ways to maintain their integrity without provoking the kind of retaliation that could destroy them entirely. There are hints, scattered through various accounts, that Bear Island maintained a kind of quiet resistance during this period. They gave the Boltons what was minimally required, paid their taxes and sent token forces when demanded. But no more than that. They didn't actively rebel, because active rebellion by such a small house would have been suicidal, but they didn't collaborate enthusiastically either. They endured. They waited. They hoped that somehow the situation might change, that justice might eventually come for the traitors who had murdered their king. The memory of Mage and Dacey, of all the Mormonts who had marched south and never returned, became part of the island's collective identity. They were heroes, martyrs who had given everything in service to their king and their duty. Their example showed the younger generation what it meant to be a Mormont, what kind of courage and loyalty the house expected of its members. In a time of darkness and oppression, these memories of honour and sacrifice were precious, something to hold on to, something that said the world hadn't always been this way and wouldn't always be this way. As we contemplate this period of Mormont history, this time of loss and grief and survival under oppression, we might consider what it takes to endure when everything seems lost, when the cause you fought for has been destroyed and the leaders you followed have been murdered. The people of Bear Island could have given up, could have despaired, could have let the weight of loss crush them. But they didn't. They stood, as their housewords proclaimed they would, as they had always stood, through raid and winter and war and betrayal. They stood because that's what Mormonts did, because their ancestors had stood before them, and their descendants would need to stand after them because standing was simply who they were. The War of the Five Kings had cost House Mormont terribly, had taken their lady and her heir, had destroyed much of their fighting strength, had left them weakened and grieving under an occupation by traitors and murderers. But the house endured, the island endured, the tradition endured. Here we stand, the word said, and even in the darkest time the house had faced in living memory, even when standing seemed almost impossible, the Mormont stood. They would continue to stand through the occupation and through whatever came after, because that was the Mormont way, and no amount of loss or grief or oppression could change that fundamental truth. In the aftermath of loss and betrayal, in the shadow of the Red Wedding and the Bolton occupation, leadership of House Mormont passed to the youngest of Major's daughters, a girl who could not have been more than 10 years old when she became Lady of Bear Island. Lyanna Mormont was a child thrust into adult responsibilities, a girl who would have to prove herself worthy of her house's legacy, at an age when most children are still learning their letters and playing with wooden swords. The fact that she not only survived this challenge but became one of the most memorable figures in Northern history tells us something important about the strength that Bear Island could produce, about what it meant to be raised in the Mormont tradition. We should pause and consider what it would have meant for Bear Island to be ruled by a child. The island had just lost its lady and most of its fighting strength. The north was occupied by traitors. The future was uncertain and frightening. And the person who had to guide the island through this crisis was a girl who had barely begun to understand what leadership required. It would have been reasonable for the remaining adults on the island to establish some kind of regency, to have Lyanna rule in name while others made the actual decisions until she came of age. But that doesn't seem to be what happened, or at least not entirely. The accounts we have, fragmentary as they are, suggest that Lyanna took her responsibilities seriously from the beginning, that she was involved in the decisions that shaped Bear Island's course through the difficult years that followed the Red Wedding. Perhaps the adults around her gave her guidance and counsel, as they certainly must have, but they seem to have allowed her real authority, real responsibility. This was the Mormont way, after all. The island had a long tradition of women in leadership, a long history of people rising to meet challenges regardless of their age or conventional expectations. Lyanna would have been shaped by the trauma of loss, even as she was learning to rule. Her mother Meg was gone, disappeared in the neck and presumed dead. Her eldest sister Daisy had been murdered at the Red Wedding. The island's warriors had been decimated. Everything that should have been stable and secure in a child's life had been torn away, replaced by responsibility and danger, and the weight of a legacy stretching back thousands of years. A lesser person might have been broken by this, might have retreated into childhood or despair, but Lyanna was a Mormont, and Mormonts did not break. The Bolton occupation of the north created a difficult political situation for all the houses that had remained loyal to the Starks. The Boltons demanded fealty, demanded that northern houses acknowledge them as wardens of the north and support their rule. For houses like the Mormonts, this demand was offensive on every level. The Boltons were traitors and murderers, kinslayers who had violated the most sacred laws of hospitality. To swear fealty to them would be to betray everything the Mormonts valued, to spit on the graves of Mage and Daisy and all the others who had died fighting for Robb Stark. But outright refusal would invite retaliation, and Bear Island was in no position to resist if the Boltons decided to make an example of them. The island's military strength had been shattered at the Red Wedding. They couldn't defend themselves against a determined assault. They needed to navigate carefully to find ways to maintain their integrity without provoking the kind of response that would destroy them. This delicate balancing act would have been challenging for an experienced ruler, and here it fell to a child. Then came a letter from Stannis Baratheon, who was marching south from the wall with an army, claiming the Iron Throne and demanding that the northern houses support him against the Boltons. Stannis was offering what many northerners desperately wanted, a chance to strike back against the traitors, to restore some semblance of justice and honour to the north. But he was also a stranger, a southern king with no real connection to the north, someone whose claim to authority was based on southern law and southern concerns that had little relevance to northern lives. Lyanna Mormont's response to Stannis' demand has become famous, one of those historical moments that captures something essential about a person and a house. She wrote back refusing his demand, and her letter was remarkable for its clarity and its fierce assertion of northern identity. The exact wording varies in different accounts, but the essence was clear. Bear Island knew no king but the king in the north, whose name was Stark. She would not bend the knee to Stannis Baratheon, would not acknowledge his authority over her island or her house. This was an extraordinary act of defiance from a 10-year-old girl, a refusal to be intimidated by a man who commanded armies, and who had dragons in his ancestry if not at his direct command. It showed a courage that went beyond physical bravery in battle, the courage to stand by your principles even when standing seemed dangerous, even when bending might have been easier and safer. It showed that Lyanna understood what her house represented, what the North represented, and that she would not compromise on those fundamental truths regardless of the threats or promises that outsiders might offer. The letter also demonstrated something else, a fierce loyalty to House Stark that persisted even after the Starks themselves seemed to have been destroyed. Robb was dead, Eddard was dead, Winterfell was held by the Boltons, and yet Lyanna still declared that the only king Bear Island would acknowledge was a Stark. This wasn't political calculation, it was faith, a belief that the Stark cause was right and just regardless of whether it seemed likely to prevail. It was the kind of loyalty that can't be bought or coerced, that comes from something deeper than advantage or fear. Stannis apparently respected the letter, or at least didn't retaliate against Bear Island for its refusal. Perhaps he recognised that trying to force a child to bend the knee would make him look tyrannical. Perhaps he simply had more important concerns and couldn't spare the resources to punish one small northern house. Whatever his reasoning, Bear Island was left alone, maintaining its independence and its principles even in the midst of the chaos that gripped the north. The isolation that had always characterised Bear Island became even more pronounced during this period. The island had always been remote, but now it was also politically isolated, refusing to acknowledge either the Bolton regime or Stannis' authority, maintaining a kind of stubborn independence that was both admirable and precarious. They were alone, relying on their own strength and their own resources, hoping that somehow the situation would change but prepared to endure if it didn't. Life on the island during Lyanna's early rule would have been hard even by Bear Island standards. The population had been reduced by the losses in the war. The economy, never strong, would have been strained by the absence of so many workers. The psychological weight of grief and loss, of living under occupation by traitors, would have affected everyone. And yet the daily work continued, because it had to continue. The fish were caught, the timber was cut, the children were raised. The traditions were maintained. Survival required pushing through grief and hardship, and the people of Bear Island knew how to survive. Then news came that changed everything. Eddard Stark's bastard son Jon Snow, who had joined the Night's Watch years earlier, had been elected Lord Commander of the Watch, and he was reaching out to the northern houses, asking for support in defending the wall against the threats beyond it, asking for men and supplies to help the Watch fulfill its ancient mission. For Lyanna Mormont, this request would have resonated deeply. The Watch was important to the north, and Jon Snow, though a bastard, was still a son of Eddard Stark, still someone whose blood connected him to the house that the Mormonts had served for thousands of years. Jon Snow's letters to the northern houses apparently combined requests for practical support with something else. A vision of the North working together against common threats. A call to remember what the North stood for beyond the petty politics and betrayals that had torn it apart. For houses like the Mormonts, for people who had remained loyal to the Stark cause even when that loyalty seemed futile, Jon's letters offered something precious. They offered hope, a sense that not all the Starks were dead, that the values they represented might yet survive. Lyanna's response to Jon Snow's request was characteristically direct and practical. Bear Island would send what it could, though what it could send was limited by its small population and its losses in the war. The famous line, preserved in various forms in the historical accounts, was that every man from Bear Island fights with the strength of 10 mainlanders. This wasn't just boasting, though there was pride in it. It was a statement of fact about the quality of Bear Island's warriors, about the training and the hardness that the island produced, about the value of what they could offer despite their small numbers. The exact number of warriors Bear Island sent to Jon Snow varies in the accounts, but it was probably around 60 men, perhaps a few more or less. For an island with a population that had been reduced by war losses and that had never been large to begin with. This was a significant contribution, representing perhaps most of the island's remaining military strength. It was a gamble, leaving the island vulnerable, but it was also an expression of faith in Jon Snow and in the importance of defending the wall against whatever threats were gathering beyond it. When Jon Snow was later killed by his own brothers in the Night's Watch, murdered in a mutiny at Castle Black, the news would have been devastating to those northern houses that had supported him. Here was another Stark, or someone close enough to being a Stark, betrayed and killed by those he should have been able to trust. The pattern seemed to be repeating, the North's loyalty and honour counting for nothing in a world of betrayal and murder. But then came even stranger news. Jon Snow had been brought back to life, resurrected by the Red Priestess Melisandre through some magic that most people didn't understand and many didn't believe. Whether Lyanna believed these reports of resurrection, we don't know. The North was sceptical of southern magic, of claims that seemed too fantastic to be true. But Jon Snow was alive again, that much seemed certain, and he was rallying support to retake Winterfell from the Boltons, to restore Stark rule to the north. For Lyanna, for all the northern houses that had remained loyal, this was the moment they had been waiting for. Finally, there was a chance to strike back against the traitors, to avenge the Red Wedding, to restore some measure of justice to the north. The Battle of the Bastards, as it came to be called, was where the Bolton regime would finally be challenged directly. Jon Snow, with the support of the wildlings he had brought south of the Wall, and whatever northern houses were willing to fight with him, would face Ramsay Bolton and his forces outside Winterfell. It was a desperate gamble. A battle that could easily end in the complete destruction of what remained of Stark support in the north. But it was also necessary because living under Bolton rule had become intolerable, and because sometimes you have to stand and fight even when the odds seem impossible. The Mormont warriors who marched to fight in this battle would have known they were risking everything. They were few in number, their island was vulnerable, and if they lost this battle, the Boltons would certainly take revenge on Bear Island for its defiance, but they marched anyway, because Jon Snow had called and because fighting the Boltons was the right thing to do, regardless of the risks. Lyanna herself was there, leading her house's warriors, a girl who couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old, standing among seasoned fighters, preparing for a battle that would determine the North's future. The Battle of the Bastards was brutal and chaotic, a grinding melee that nearly destroyed Jon's forces before the Knights of the Vale arrived at the last moment and turned the tide. The Mormont warriors fought in that chaos, stood firm when Jon's army was being encircled and crushed, contributed their strength to holding the line long enough for rescue to arrive. How many of them survived, we don't know for certain. The battle was costly for all the houses that fought there, and the Mormonts, always few in number, probably took casualties they could ill afford, but they survived, and more importantly, they won. Ramsay Bolton was defeated, captured, and eventually executed by Sansa Stark for his crimes. Winterfell was restored to Stark control. The Bolton regime was destroyed, the traitors punished, and the North was free again to choose its own course. For Lyanna Mormont, for all the survivors of the Red Wedding and the Bolton occupation, this victory was vindication of their loyalty, proof that standing firm even in the darkest times could eventually lead to justice. In the aftermath of the battle, the Northern Lords gathered at Winterfell to decide what would come next. The realm was still at war, the politics were still incredibly complex, but the North had to choose a leader, had to determine who would speak for them and lead them forward. And in that gathering, it was Lyanna Mormont who stood and made the case that would sway the other lords, that would restore the title of king in the North after it had been vacant since Robb Stark's murder. Lyanna argued that Jon Snow should be king, that despite being a bastard, he had proven himself worthy through his actions. He had defended the Wall, had brought the wildlings south to help defend the realm rather than attack it, had led the fight to retake Winterfell from the Boltons. He had Stark blood, even if born outside of marriage, and he had shown the qualities that a king needed. Her speech, brief but powerful, shamed the older lords who were hesitating, who were concerned about precedent and legitimacy, who were calculating advantage rather than simply doing what was right. The other lords followed Lyanna's lead, declaring Jon Snow king in the North, restoring the title that had been lost when Torrhen Stark bent the knee to Aegon Targaryen 3 centuries earlier. It was a remarkable moment, a child shaming adults into doing their duty, a girl from a minor house providing the leadership that the great houses lacked, and it showed what Bear Island had always represented, the willingness to stand for what was right regardless of politics or calculation, the courage to speak truth even when others stayed silent. But even as the North was restoring itself, even as Jon Snow was crowned and Winterfell was reclaimed, a greater threat was approaching. The White Walkers, the others of legend, the ancient enemy that had been defeated 8,000 years ago during the Long Night, were returning. The Wall had fallen, destroyed by the Night King riding a dead dragon, and the army of the dead was marching south toward the realms of men. Everything that had seemed important, all the political conflicts and dynastic struggles, suddenly meant nothing compared to the existential threat of extinction that the White Walkers represented. The North prepared for the battle that would determine whether humanity survived. Winterfell was fortified, armies were gathered, alliances were made with forces from the south who finally understood the magnitude of the threat, and among those preparing to fight were the warriors of Bear Island, the remaining strength of House Mormont, ready to stand one final time against an enemy unlike any they had faced before. An enemy that didn't raid for plunder or fight for territory, but simply wanted to destroy all life, to turn the world into an endless winter populated only by the dead. Lyanna Mormont fought in the Battle of Winterfell, the longest night, the great battle against the army of the dead. She was young, still just a girl really, but she stood with her warriors, fought with them, refused to hide while others faced danger. The accounts of the battle are fragmentary and confused, as accounts of chaotic battles always are. But what seems clear is that Lyanna died fighting a white giant, one of the massive undead creatures that the Night King had raised to serve in his army. The image that has come down to us is almost mythic. A small girl, armed with a blade covered in dragon glass that could kill the undead, facing a giant perhaps 20 feet tall, a creature of impossible strength and malevolence. The giant crushed her, killed her with its bare hands, but even as she died, Lyanna drove her blade into the giant's eye, destroying it even as it destroyed her. It was a death of extraordinary courage, the kind of end that would be remembered in songs if anyone survived to sing them. She was perhaps 14 years old when she died, maybe 15, still a child by any reasonable standard, though she had never really been allowed the luxury of childhood. From the age of 10, she had borne the weight of House Mormont's leadership, had navigated impossible political situations, had made decisions that shaped her house's fate. She had defied Stannis Baratheon, had rallied to Jon Snow's cause, had helped crown him king in the north, had led her warriors to fight the Boltons and then the dead. In her few short years of leadership, she had proven herself worthy of the Mormont name, had embodied everything the house represented. Her death marked the end of something, the final chapter in House Mormont's long story. With Lyanna gone, with so many of the house's warriors dead in the various battles they had fought, with the island's population reduced by war and loss, it's unclear whether House Mormont survived as a functioning entity. Perhaps some distant relative assumed leadership, perhaps the island found a way to continue. But the great tradition, the thousands of years of service and strength, of women warriors and fierce loyalty, seemed to have reached its conclusion in Lyanna's sacrifice. And yet, what a conclusion it was. A child facing a giant, refusing to yield, striking her final blow even as death claimed her. Quote 1, the Mormont words proclaimed, and Lyanna stood literally to the very end, stood against the ultimate enemy, stood in defense of all humanity. She died, as Mormonts had always died, in service to their duty, in protection of something greater than themselves, refusing to break no matter what faced them. As we contemplate Lyanna Mormont's brief life and heroic death, we might consider what it means to rise to meet impossible challenges, to accept responsibilities far beyond what should be asked of someone so young, to face death with courage rather than fleeing to safety. Lyanna could have stayed on Bear Island, could have kept her warriors home, could have let others fight the battles while she preserved her house's remaining strength. No one would have blamed a child for choosing survival over sacrifice. But that wasn't the Mormont way, and Lyanna was every inch a Mormont. Her legacy, and through her the legacy of her entire house, was one of courage and loyalty, of standing firm when standing was hard, of serving faithfully regardless of cost. From the ancient lords who first held Bear Island against the Ironborn, through thousands of years of raids and wars and harsh winters, through Jeor's service at the Wall and Jorah's disgrace and exile, through Mage and Dacey's deaths at the Red Wedding, through Lyanna's final stand against the giant, the thread remained unbroken. House Mormont stood, generation after generation, crisis after crisis, challenge after challenge. They stood because that's what Mormonts did, because their words proclaimed it and their actions proved it, because standing was simply who they were. If you're finding these contemplative explorations of Westerosi history and politics a peaceful way to end your day, a like and subscribe really helps others discover these gentle journeys through the past. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of those who find comfort in slowly unfolding stories of power and patience, of roses growing strong through centuries of careful cultivation. Now that we've travelled through the long history of House Mormont, from their shadowy origins in the Age of Heroes to Lyanna's final stand against the giant, we should step back and contemplate what this house and its story actually represent, what lessons or insights we might draw from thousands of years of service and sacrifice on a remote northern island. The Mormonts were never the most powerful house, never the wealthiest or the most famous, never the makers of grand history in the way that houses like Stark or Lannister were, but they were essential in a different way, essential to understanding how societies actually function, how the small houses and the forgotten people make possible the achievements we celebrate. The geographic isolation of Bear Island shaped everything about House Mormont, created the conditions that forged their distinctive character and values. An island off the western coast of the north, cold and harsh. Separated from the mainland by treacherous waters, this was not a place that anyone would choose if they had better options. The people who lived there, who stayed there across millennia, did so because it was their home, because their ancestors had held it, and their descendants would need to hold it after them, because duty and loyalty mattered more than comfort or ease. The land was hard, and so the people became hard, not cruel exactly, but resilient, practical, capable of enduring what softer people could not. This relationship between geography and character is worth pondering. We often think of personality and culture as things that emerge from choices, from deliberate decisions about values and priorities. But the Mormonts suggest something different, or something additional. They suggest that the land shapes the people as much as the people shape themselves, that living on Bear Island for generations inevitably produced a certain kind of person, someone who understood endurance and self-reliance, someone who knew that survival required strength and vigilance, someone who couldn't afford to be soft or careless because the environment punished weakness without mercy. The tradition of women warriors, which made House Mormont distinctive throughout Westeros, emerged from this harsh environment and from the constant threat of ironborn raids. It wasn't ideology that led the Mormonts to train their women in combat, it was necessity. When raiders came and the men were away, the women needed to be able to defend their homes and children. Over time, this necessity became tradition, and that tradition became part of the Mormont identity, something they were known for and proud of. But it began with simple survival, with the practical recognition that Bear Island couldn't afford to leave half its population untrained and unable to defend themselves. This points to something interesting about how cultures evolve, how practices that begin as pragmatic responses to specific challenges can become deeply embedded values that persist even after the original challenges have faded. The Ironborn raids became less frequent under Targaryen rule and nearly ceased entirely in later years, yet the Mormonts continued training their women as warriors. It had become who they were, not just what they did. An identity is more persistent than practice. Mage and her daughters, Lyanna facing the giant, these women were carrying on a tradition that stretched back thousands of years, a tradition born of necessity but maintained through pride and understanding of what made their house special. The loyalty of House Mormont to House Stark, maintained across thousands of years through every kind of crisis and challenge, deserves our careful consideration. This wasn't the calculating loyalty of houses that switch sides when advantage dictates, that serve whoever seems likely to win or whoever offers the best rewards. This was something deeper, more fundamental, a loyalty so embedded in Mormont identity that betraying it would have meant ceasing to be Mormonts in any meaningful sense. Even when the Starks fell, even when Robb was murdered and Winterfell was held by traitors, even when loyalty seemed futile and foolish, the Mormonts remained loyal. What creates this kind of enduring loyalty? Part of it was surely practical, the understanding that smaller houses need powerful protectors, that the Mormonts needed the Starks as much as the Starks needed them. But that practical calculation doesn't explain the depths of the loyalty. Doesn't explain why Lyanna would defy Stannis Baratheon, or why Mage and Dacey would die at the Red Wedding rather than abandoning their king. There was something more than calculation involved, something about shared values and mutual respect, about the fact that the Starks had always treated the Mormonts fairly, had valued their service, had never asked them to compromise their honour or betray their principles. This suggests that loyalty, real loyalty that endures across generations, is built not through grand gestures but through consistent decent treatment, through keeping faith, through respecting those who serve you even when they're small and remote and seemingly unimportant. The Starks could have neglected Bear Island, could have taken the Mormonts for granted, and if they had, that loyalty might have eroded over time. But they didn't, and so the Mormonts remained loyal through everything, loyal even unto death and beyond death, loyal when loyalty cost them everything and gained them nothing tangible. The story of Jorah Mormont, the disgrace and the exile, stands as a counterpoint to the house's general pattern of honour and service, and that counterpoint is important to understanding the whole picture. Jorah was raised in the same traditions as every other Mormont, taught the same values, shaped by the same harsh environment, and yet he failed, made terrible choices, betrayed his duties and his honour. This tells us that culture and tradition, however strong, cannot guarantee virtue, that individuals can always choose poorly regardless of how well they've been raised, or what examples they've been shown. But Jorah's failure also illuminates what the Mormont tradition actually meant, because the contrast is so stark. When we see someone fall short of a standard, we understand that standard more clearly than we might have otherwise. Jorah's descent into dishonour, his selling of men into slavery, his flight from justice, all of this violated the Mormont code so completely that it proved how serious that code was, how deeply it mattered. The universal condemnation of his actions, the fact that even his own father couldn't excuse or minimise what he had done, showed that Mormont honour wasn't just rhetoric or pretense, it was real, it had substance, and violations of it would be treated with appropriate seriousness. There's also something worth considering in how Jorah's story reflects the tension between personal desire and duty, between love and honour, between what we want and what we owe. Jorah wanted to make Lynesse happy, wanted to give her the life she deserved, and these were not evil desires. The love he felt for her was probably genuine, however misguided his expressions of it became. But he allowed that personal desire to overwhelm his duties, allowed his love for one woman to justify betraying the people he was responsible for protecting and serving. The tragedy is that his choices didn't even achieve what he wanted. Lynesse left him anyway, and all he gained from his crimes was exile and disgrace. The contrast between Jeor and Jorah, father and son, is particularly striking and painful. Jeor embodied everything the Mormont tradition represented: duty before personal comfort, service over ease, standing firm through every challenge. He left Bear Island to serve at the Wall, gave up lordship and family for the Watch, served as Lord Commander through incredibly difficult circumstances, and maintained his honour even when his son's disgrace would have given him every excuse to abandon his post and retreat into grief. Jorah embodied the opposite: personal desire over duty, the pursuit of comfort and status, the willingness to betray principle for advantage. That these two men came from the same house, the same family, the same traditions, shows both the power and the limits of cultural inheritance. The role of small houses in the feudal structure of Westeros is illuminated by the Mormont story. The great houses, the Starks and Lannisters and Tyrells, get most of the attention in histories because they make the grand decisions, fight the great battles, shape the realm's destiny. But the realm actually functions because of the countless small houses like the Mormonts, the minor lords who hold isolated fortresses, who defend remote borders, who maintain order in their small territories and answer their liege lord's call when summoned. Without these small houses, the great houses would have no foundation, no base of support, no way to actually govern their vast territories. The Mormonts were important not because they fielded great armies or possessed vast wealth, but because they held Bear Island reliably, generation after generation, serving as the North's western shield against ironborn raids, contributing their strength whenever the Starks needed it, maintaining the northern character and values in their remote corner of the realm. They were part of the infrastructure of feudalism, one of the countless supporting pillars that held up the entire structure. When we think about how medieval societies actually worked, we need to think about houses like the Mormonts as much as houses like the Starks, because both were essential to the system's functioning. The sacrifice that runs through Mormont history, from the nameless warriors who died defending against ironborn raids, through the soldiers who marched south with Eddard Stark and Robb Stark and never returned, to Dacey's death at the Red Wedding and Lyanna's death fighting the giant, this cumulative sacrifice deserves our contemplation. These people gave up their comfort, their safety, their lives, in service to duties and loyalties that often brought them no tangible benefit. They didn't become famous or wealthy through their service. Most of them died unknown, their names forgotten even if their contributions mattered. What makes people willing to sacrifice in this way? Part of it is surely the feudal structure itself, the obligations of vassalage that weren't really optional. But obligation alone doesn't explain the quality of the sacrifice, doesn't explain why the Mormonts served so faithfully when grudging minimal compliance would have been easier. There was something else involved, a genuine belief that their service mattered, that duty was worth honouring, that standing firm was valuable in itself regardless of whether it brought rewards. This kind of commitment, this willingness to give everything for principles and loyalties, is rare in any age, and its presence in the Mormont story elevates that story from mere historical chronicle to something more profound. The question of whether honour is worth its price, whether loyalty and duty justify the cost they exact, runs through the Mormont story without ever being definitively answered. The Mormonts paid terribly for their honour, lost wars and family members, endured hardship and grief, saw their house brought to the edge of extinction by their faithful service. From a purely practical standpoint, from a perspective that values survival and prosperity above principle, the Mormont choices often seem foolish. Why remain loyal to the Starks when that loyalty cost them so much? Why fight battles that brought them no advantage? Why stand when bending would have been safer and easier? But from another perspective, from the perspective that values meaning and integrity above mere survival, the Mormont choices make perfect sense. They stood because standing mattered, because honour was valuable in itself, because a life lived according to principle was worth more than a longer life lived in compromise and shame. When Lyanna faced the giant, she could have run, could have let others fight while she preserved herself. But she stood, and her death had meaning precisely because it was chosen, because it represented her values and her house's values, because it was the culmination of thousands of years of Mormonts choosing duty over safety. The persistence of the Mormont identity across such vast stretches of time, through so many changes and challenges, is itself remarkable and worth pondering. The world changed enormously between the Age of Heroes and the War of the Five Kings. The Andals invaded. Kingdoms rose and fell, dragons came to Westeros and then disappeared, technologies evolved, religions spread, the political map was redrawn countless times. And yet through all of this, House Mormont remained recognisably Mormont, maintaining their core identity and values, even as the context around them transformed completely. This persistence suggests something about the power of culture and tradition, about how communities can maintain continuity across generations through the transmission of stories and values, through the deliberate teaching of what it means to belong to a particular group. Each generation of Mormonts taught the next what it meant to be from Bear Island, what the house stood for, what was expected of those who bore the Mormont name. And each generation internalized these lessons and passed them on, creating a chain of identity that stretched across millennia. This is how human communities actually work, how they maintain themselves across time through this patient work of cultural transmission that happens mostly outside the notice of formal history. The end of House Mormont, if indeed it ended with Lyanna's death, is simultaneously tragic and fitting. Tragic because thousands of years of history, of service and sacrifice, of distinctive identity and proud tradition came to a close. A house that had survived everything, that had stood firm through raid and war and winter and betrayal, was finally broken by the ultimate enemy, by the army of the dead that sought to destroy all life. But fitting because the end came in service, came in a final stand against the greatest threat humanity had ever faced, came with Lyanna embodying everything her house had always represented. If you have to end, if your long story must reach its conclusion, ending in a heroic last stand against the apocalypse is perhaps the best ending available. Better than fading away into irrelevance. Better than being absorbed into another house through marriage and losing your identity. Better than compromising your values and surviving in shame. The Mormonts went out as they had always lived, standing firm, refusing to yield, fighting for something greater than themselves. "Here we stand," their words proclaimed, and they stood literally to the last member, to the last breath. But perhaps House Mormont didn't entirely end, even if the formal structure of the house was destroyed. The values they represented, the example they set, the story they wrote across thousands of years, these things persist in memory and influence even after the house itself is gone. The North remembers, as the saying goes, and what the North remembers about House Mormont is loyalty and courage, is women who fought as fiercely as men, is service without complaint, is standing firm when standing was hard. These memories, these examples continue to shape how people think about honour and duty, continue to inspire those who hear the stories. There's also the possibility that some Mormont survived, that distant relatives or cadet branches of the house continued elsewhere, that the Mormont name and perhaps even some of the Mormont values persisted in different forms. History is rarely as neat as we like to imagine, and houses that seem to end often have unexpected continuations in places and ways we don't immediately recognise. But even if the formal house ended with Lyanna, even if Bear Island passed to other hands or was abandoned entirely, the essential Mormont legacy would remain in the larger story of the North and of Westeros. As we contemplate what House Mormont means, what they contributed to the world they inhabited, we might consider the importance of those who serve faithfully in difficult places, who do essential work that goes largely unrecognised, who maintain their integrity even when compromise would be easier. The Mormonts were never the main characters in Westeros's grand story, but they were essential supporting characters, the kind of people who make heroism possible by maintaining the ordinary structures that heroes rely on. Every society needs its Mormonts, its reliable servants who will stand their watch regardless of recognition or reward, who will do their duty because duty matters, who will sacrifice when sacrifice is required. These people, these houses, these communities, they're the foundation on which everything else is built. The spectacular achievements get remembered and celebrated, but the patient endurance, the faithful service, the standing firm through difficulty, this is what actually keeps societies functioning across generations. The Mormont story is ultimately a story about endurance, about standing when standing is all you can do, about maintaining your identity and your values through whatever challenges arise. It's about the relationship between land and people, about how harsh environments create hard people, about the way geography shapes culture in profound and lasting ways. It's about loyalty and its costs, about the price of honour and the question of whether that price is worth paying. It's about small houses and forgotten people, about those who serve faithfully without seeking glory, about the essential work that happens away from the centres of power and attention. It's about women who fought, about traditions that emerged from necessity and persisted through pride, about a community that defined itself partly through the ways it was different from others. It's about fathers and sons, about the transmission of values across generations, about how even the best traditions can't guarantee virtue but can create strong presumptions toward it. It's about sacrifice and service, about giving everything for duties and loyalties that matter more than individual survival. And perhaps most fundamentally it's about standing firm, about refusing to yield or compromise or break regardless of the pressures and temptations and threats that surround you. Quote 1, the Mormonts proclaimed, "And they stood for thousands of years, stood through everything, stood until there was no one left to stand." In a world of compromise and calculation, of shifting loyalties and flexible principles, the Mormonts stood for something different. Something harder and perhaps more valuable. They stood for the idea that some things matter more than advantage, that honour has value in itself, that duty and loyalty and service are worth upholding regardless of cost. Whether we agree with these values, whether we think the Mormont choices were wise or foolish, whether we believe honour is worth its price, these are questions each of us must answer for ourselves. But the Mormont example remains. A story of a small house on a remote island that maintained its integrity across thousands of years, that served faithfully through every challenge, that stood firm until the very end. It's a story worth remembering, worth contemplating, worth carrying forward into whatever future awaits us. The bear endures in memory even after the last bear has fallen, and perhaps that endurance in memory is itself a kind of victory, a kind of immortality, a way of standing that transcends even death. We've travelled together through thousands of years, from the Age of Heroes to the Long Night, from the first Mormonts who held Bear Island against the Ironborn to young Lyanna facing the giant. We've witnessed loyalty that never wavered, courage that never broke, a house that stood firm through every storm. The cold waters off the western coast, the dark forests of the island, the harsh winters that tested everyone who lived there, all of it shaped a people who knew that endurance mattered more than comfort, that duty mattered more than ease. The Mormonts were never the most powerful, never the most famous, but they stood. Through raid and rebellion, through disgrace and redemption, through loss that would have broken lesser houses, they stood. Mage and Dacey sleeping beneath southern soil, Jeor standing his watch at the wall until the very end. Lyanna facing impossible odds with a courage far beyond her years. Here we stand, they said, and they meant it. Every generation finding the strength to stand when standing was required. But you don't need to stand anymore tonight. You've kept your own watch through the day, borne your own burdens, done what needed to be done. Now you can rest. Let the story of the bears and their island drift away like snow melting in your hand. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts quiet. Let the warmth of your bed hold you safe. The North remembers, but you can forget for now, can let go of everything, can simply drift into peaceful darkness. And now your watch has ended. Sleep well.